the food prices, energy prices, the supply of gas and oil, which are also very significantly affecting the global economy, the regional supply of gas and oil. And finally, we'll have also discussion about geopolitics, where our colleagues from the School of International Affairs will be those who will take more opinions as to what does it mean for the future global order. Here we can also come to India and discuss a bit about the Indian position on the aggression and Chinese position, if you want, and so on. So without further ado, I would like now to pass to Anirudh for his moderation of the first roundtable discussion, and I will come later for the international law, the law part of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So, Anirudh, you are welcome to take a lead on this.
Good afternoon, good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I hope Alexander is doing well because he hurt himself yesterday. He played a major part. Yeah, someone has to mute the microphone. Yeah, so I hope Alexander is well. Then what fascinated me to look at this issue critically was I'm part of an investors group, and we invest small amount of money in global capital markets. And suddenly, when we were feeling that the world is emerging out of COVID, we had this Russian aggression over Ukraine, and the capital markets were completely volatile. We saw the moment American sanctions happened on Russia, the Russian stock markets went down 50%. And that to me, I felt like it's quite irrational. Why would you take such a big risk and take war as an instrument of state policy? Was it not possible to engage in more aggressive diplomatic conversations to ensure that there could be more stability, there could be the trade could happen, the economic crisis shouldn't be there, and then everyone is well off. So that whole idea, I felt like it was quite irrational, and so that motivated me to ask questions from you guys, because I feel that we at Jindal have enormous intellectual capital to look at this issue critically, both from law, from business, and from international relations perspective. In our panel today, at the business panel, we have some extremely esteemed scholars. We have, to start with, we have Professor Amar Rao. Professor Amar is unique because he's a data analyst. So he looks at global capital markets from data position. Then we have Professor Dipanshu Mohan. Professor Dipanshu Mohan is a developmental economist with a special focus on issues related to development and how global geopolitics can affect development. Then we have Professor Vineet Anurag. Professor Vineet Anurag had a 3 decades long career in global capital markets, investment finance, investment banking. And then we have Professor Julian Perret, who is joining us from Alliance University, Bangalore. Professor Julian has 1 decade of scholarship on Russian history and post-Soviet Russian world. So I would like to start with Professor Amar Rao, because he brings us the data perspective of this conflict that we are seeing right now. Over to you, Professor Rao.
Well, sir, let me just share my screen. Okay, I think the host disabled my screen sharing. Hope I am audible. Right. So I will just start with the one fact that why financial markets are resilient. I want to speak about that Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. All we know about that, and it's still ongoing. Now, if you look at the perspective of the global financial markets, initially they reacted. But if you look at the database, and if some global investors look at it very closely, before the Ukraine invasion, the amount of that Russian dollar debt, it was not much that. It was hardly around, I think, approximately $20 billion by the foreign investors. And the Russian stock market, or you can say the financial markets, they were not integrated that much into the global financial markets. And to create a problem, to create ripples, one day ripple is okay. That was shock. But to create ripples for a long term, it has to be integrated. So if you look at $20 billion of debt, and I think hardly ruble denominated bonds by the foreign investor, it was only $37 billion. This is according to their central bank. So it was very small. Now, why the global financial market reacted initially? Because if you look at the fund managers or the fund houses like BlackRock and PIMCO, they were mainly invested in that. And their damage actually aggravated the fall of the stock markets initially. And they literally recovered of that. Now, as per my understanding, if I look at the data from the different fund houses and the central banks, they've already written off their bonds to the Russian country and their exposure. Now, this is a statement from the IMF, International Monetary Fund. So, if you look at the overall exposure to the foreign markets of Russia, it's hardly $120 billion, which is not significant if you look at the overall bond market of the world. So it is not systematically relevant. So if you ask me, and my analysis says that the financial markets will keep ignoring them. Yes, what is hurting the financial market are the food prices and the oil prices, which I come later on. Now, if you look at the energy prices, again, they are in the range of $100 and $5, because if you look at I belong from India, and India made a deal with Russia to purchase the crude oil at a very low prices. What worry me is that the food prices. If you look at the euro area, the inflation, I think in the last March 2022, it was around 7.4%. That's a very high reading. If you look at the inflation of the United States of America, already 46 years high. And if you look at my country, that is India, the inflation, and recently 2 days back, the Reserve Bank of India increased the policy rate by 40 bps. So if you look at overall, what is hurting is that the energy prices, right? But again, if you look at the positive side of this, high energy prices might prompt countries to shift to electric vehicles. That's my preliminary analysis. One, financial markets won't be impacted for a longer term. Second, energy prices will not touch more than $120 per barrel, because in the next 6 months we are looking at a ceasefire. That's my hypothesis. And the third, food prices are going to come down, including the commodity prices. That's my preliminary discussion, and I will keep on discussing for that. Over to you, Niranjan.
Another thing that I want to discuss is post 1991 or post the fall of Soviet wall. I teach MBA. So there was a big asymptotic increase in the number of MBA students. Why? Because in a monopolar world, it's pretty much deterministic. The world is deterministic. We can determine what's going to happen. We know it's a rational individual, and all the theories that we study, the world believes in the laws, and therefore any theory on management is pretty much predictable. But there's enormous instability or uncertainty when there is a bipolar world, because we don't know how the other side is going to behave. And is it good? Now, assuming if we believe that Russia wants to again resurrect its pre-wall supremacy or pre-wall bipolar world, how will the business change? Because there would be tremendous uncertainty in the business world, because the international laws can be skewed in favor of one or the other. And that could lead to uncertainty. Therefore, the contracts may not be respected. Therefore, the multilateralism might might get affected. They would be more focused on bilateralism. And all this would change the world order as we know it since 1990s. So, and that is called, that may, I don't know if it's a long term or not, but that may cause tremendous uncertainty going forward in the coming, let's say, 5 to 10 years.
So, Dr. Hill, what we need to understand is that you correctly said that the academic theories, they are based on predictability and what's going to happen. And as an MBA or a management students, we try to forecast what will happen in a particular scenario and scenario building. But I won't call these uncertainties, they are necessary. Why they are necessary, as you discussed since 1990s. If you look at the cycle, usually business cycle is of 10 to 12 years. But if you look at the geopolitical cycles, it's around 25, 30 years. That's my experience with the data. 25, 30 years as a geopolitical sciences. If you look at the post-Afghanistan, post-Afghan war, post-Iraq war, post-Vietnam, go back to the time. Now, the question you asked is that, what about this uncertainty? This uncertainty is very necessary to bring the new order into the system. This uncertainty is necessary to bring, to give a shock to the investors. Look, there is a risk involved. You cannot believe that everything is going to be right. This uncertainty is necessary because see, geopolitical instability, commodity price volatility, and supply chain disruption, it will keep impacting on the global order. The new order has to come, right? The existing world has to take a pain to come up with some new powers. So I'm not an expert on geopolitical, but what I can sense from the business perspective is that I won't call it a bipolar. People and the experts are saying that the world will be again in the Cold War. One side is with Russia and China, one side the USA and other countries. It won't happen. The world will realize you need to work on your supply chain, you need to work on your manufacturing. Might be the new countries will emerge with a manufacturing powerhouse. Uncertainty will be there. Academic theories, when it comes to practical world, they need to modify it. We cannot work on the same academic theories which were in the 90s. Risk, uncertainty will always be there. Might be this generation will forget that yes, there was a Vietnam War, there was a Afghan War. I'm not going back to older times, but this will bring a new order. It depends which country is which side. Now, there's a very interesting fact as you just touched. Now, we all know that semiconductors, right? There is a shortage and there is a long supply of electronic equipments. Now, Ukraine produces 50% of the neon gas, which is used in the semiconductor. It means the semiconductor was in shortage because of the excessive demand caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in the electronic markets. Now, Ukraine, 50% neon gas, again, it created a shortage. Now, that kind of uncertainty. Now, what will happen? Either two things can happen. The world will keep relying on Ukraine, or either it will develop some other alternative form to make the semiconductor chips. That's what I'm saying. Uncertainty and the risk, it is necessary. Now, the second point, what you talked about, the predictability, as far as I know, that the scenario build-up, you will always need to encounter the uncertainty and the risk factor involved in that. And if you look at the global capital flight, the global financial markets, they were overpriced. Even if you look at the P by E method or any other valuation method, they were overpriced. Look at the IPO markets of different countries, they were overpriced. They were just looking for a needle to blow up the balloon, which was growing without any reasons, right? So that's my view.
Okay, thanks, Amar. I would like to give the baton to Professor Dipanshu Mohan. Professor Dipanshu.
All right, thank you. So this is part of a second forward conversation. I think Tatiana was there in the previous dialogue we had, which was immediately after the aggression had broke out. There's more information and data now out there which sort of correlates with two or three No, but mic to connect. They're saying they're not able to hear. Can you hear me now? All right. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So what I was trying to say just very quickly, the nature of questions that we have trying to understand the economic or the business ramifications of the current series of shocks ranges on trying to study the impact of just say sanctions on Russia's economy, which is, I think, an important question to ask because many countries, starting from the US to countries across Europe, were sort of coming in together to respond to what Russia was doing in Ukraine. And that unprovoked military aggression, and I'm using the word unprovoked consciously, on the territorial sovereignty of another nation, came at a time when already countries were recovering from a series of shock after COVID and the response to COVID. So as a theorist or as an economist, a lot of times the questions that come up when there are shocks like this is on trying to assess the effectiveness of a particular tool. Now, sanctions, the way they have been unleashed, as Raghuram Rajan pointed out, could be economic weapons of mass destruction. Do they work? Do they not work? Under what context or conditions do sanctions work? There's a lot of literature on this. And I think it just gives us as scholars a chance to get a sense of what is happening right now and draw deductions accordingly. There are a series of questions, as you see in the third point that are put up in here, on the demonstration effect of Western sanctions on Russia and the world economy at large, whether this would evoke a reaction from China and other countries. Will many countries shift their foreign currency reserves away from US denominated securities? Is there an end on the reliance of the US dollar? A lot of these questions have been coming up. I don't think they were out there only at the time when this event happened, but they've been out. I think there is an exacerbation of focus clearly. So it becomes important to look at some of these questions. But before we just sort of jump into, and I hope that the discussion can revolve around the specificity of looking at some of the questions that are put up here, because that's the most of what we can do. What can be forecasted or how you can see the situation unfolding, I think none of us can have any clue, given the circumstances of not just the war, but generally how the economies around the world have been functioning. I wanted, for the benefit of our audience and panelists, this particular chart, which has come out from a data point very recently. This is Russia's revenue from fossil fuel exports. And remember, this is fossil fuel exports. It includes pipeline gas, crude oil, and other fossil fuels as well. How that has shaped up first 2 months of the country's war against Ukraine. If you closely see, the nature of exports that were happening earlier as well were predominantly in Europe. And much less of the trade was happening with countries like India or Japan. But it's almost baffling to see the extent of increase in exports, or let's say imports by European countries, particularly in areas of pipeline gas. So you have a situation now where many countries in Europe, including Germany, are contemplating whether they want to have an oil embargo or restriction of crude oil imports from Russia. Even if that happens, you see the bulk of the import basket is coming in areas of pipeline gas and others. So I'm curious to understand whether the purpose of sanctions here is a mix of both optics, because there is something that needs to be done against Russia, and whether that is going to be enough to punish, if not deter, because Biden's words were very clear that Russia needs to be punished for what it's doing, or rather Putin needs to be punished for what he's doing. And if the goal and aim here is to punish, you cannot achieve effectiveness without having a comprehensive set of sanctions on imports or energy imports from Russia, point number one. Second, a targeted outreach on wealth of oligarchs or Russian oligarchs that's present in most European countries, including that of the UK, and almost concealed in Putin. And there's very little effect of that is to be seen right now. There is, as an Indian citizen and as a scholar working out in South Asia, a lot of the question and discussion last time we were part of this discussion was, what can India do, and what can or what must India do in a situation like this? Clearly, as some of us we've written, India, while being silent on the world stage, has in a wheeled manner taken Russia's stance. There are discussions ongoing, which is widely being documented and reported now, for India to buy cheap Russian oil as much as it can. And India's stance seems to be clear, irrespective of what's happening in Ukraine. India's position is it wants to continue trading with Russia or even expand its trading arrangements. The rupee currency trade pact, which was in the lines of discussion between the finance ministries on both sides, is still at play, and one can sense that it will only expand India's relationship with Russia. The chart in here, for those present online, can get a sense that India's trade relationship with Russia is not as extensive as you can see with many other countries that are dependent on Russian fossil fuel exports. Our nature of relationship was largely endowed in areas of defense. And if you look at the nature of India-Russia military relationship, most of that, and I've just sort of extrapolated quotes from articles that were written by me during the period of time of analyzing the impact of sanctions. So I've not sort of gone ahead and sort of have specific points for this discussion, is that there is a path-dependent relationship between Russia and India, geopolitically, economically, but there is a lot that India can do to substitute for its dependence on Russia if there is a conscious effort to do so. So what I'm trying to say is we're not dependent on Russia in a way where we cannot take a stance which is an aggressive posture in delinking our supply chains. That's what I'm trying to argue in here. And that's the argument I made previously as well. The thing we have to look at it from a global perspective, because this panel is looking at the global macroeconomic implications of the crisis and the shock, is to look at currency volatility as the first point. A crashing ruble creates panic amongst not just Russian citizens, but it creates a panic at world investors and global investors as well. The volatility is something which clearly has ramifications for debt exposure levels, not just of Russia, which is quite substantive to the rest of the world, and but also for its monetary policy as well. Now, inflation, which is already rising, as most of you would know, is triggering and impacting India and countries like much of the developing world across the world in not just food and energy, but also as a result of increase in consumer demand, which is triggering a higher demand for goods and services, but supply is not being unleashed at the same time. So you have a cycle of inflation which was happening before this war broke out, and that's only being coupled or combined or complemented with the shock. I don't personally see anywhere inflation settling down. In fact, back in October, when I first sort of looked at the data around inflation, said this is not a temporal shock. You expect prices to rise sustainably over the next year and a half. So for the most of this year, we should be willing to pay more prices. My problem as a development economist is twofold. This will have a serious ramification for what is becoming is an evaporating middle class. The consumer demand for goods and services, which are most essential to an upward mobile income class of citizens, let's say in India or much of the developing world, will find it difficult to afford essential goods and commodities. This will have impact on nutritional outcomes, childcare, welfare expenditure, many other things. So I'm not only concerned by looking at inflation as a tax on citizens who are part of the wealth endowed group, but largely the middle income group and lower middle income group who are facing the brunt of the current crisis. The energy transition and the transfusion that was happening around the period of time, much for the pre-Russia-Ukraine situation, stands to be damaged. Countries will be very reluctant to put extra resources towards renewable energy, and the fiscal priorities currently seems to be more on defense spending than welfare expenditure. I'll just take a minute and then stop it. So in most of the current situation, you will see that macroeconomics will tell you that nothing is going right at least the level of not just Russia regionally, but also at the global level. Every country is pretty much on its own, and you might see that in that scenario, India is trying to do what serves to its own best economic interests, whatever that may be put, if seen also from a very amoral perspective. But I think somewhere we have to ask the larger question here of what the US and its allies wanted to achieve. I think that's where I'd sort of make the final point for scholars to sort of reflect on. If a targeted state like Russia was strong, politically and economically stable, hostile, and autocratic, which in cases autocratic it is, it would have had limited chances of success for sanctions to work, which clearly it seems that that's the scenario which is looking like. Multilateral organizations such as the UN should have, done a little more than what it could to be able to look and point out at the behavior of the Russians in Ukraine, and the human cost and suffering has been massive. I think there is a lot of narrative that has come out which sort of attacks what Russian soldiers have done in terms of war crimes in Ukraine. All of this has, by the way, a very strong economic impact. A lot of people see this as something which human cost of a war or a suffering only is important to ethnographers or anthropologists. That's not the case. Economies work on trust and mutual partnerships and relationships. And if you have a country which is sort of incurring that amount of suffering on the citizenry of another country, you will have clear impacts and reactions across the world. Having said that, the final point which I want to make is there is a lot more that the sanction need to look at going forward. If the next 2 to 3 months do not see a direct ceiling, and I'm using the word ceiling very strongly, or an embargo on oil or fossil fuel exports from Russia, I don't see much of change happening in terms of partnerships with many countries between Russia, China, Russia, India in most cases. That's point number one. Second, most Russian wealth is with its endowed oligarchic capital, which is endowed in areas or entrenched in real estate, property, much within European countries, and which would require internal reforms within these countries. So while UK has been supportive of what's happened internationally, there's very little the UK administration has done internally to attack the wealth of Russian oligarchs in its own countries, and particularly in its own, cities like London. Now, that creates always this sort of a question. Yeah, no, I'm going to stop right there. This requires a lot of reflection only on one thing. The reason I've sort of brought all these points together here is because last conversation we had was very segregated on all these lines. I hope that as we are moving the conversation forward, you look at not just effectiveness of sanctions, but look at the geopolitical and legal ramifications of that for everyone. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Mohan. You clearly set the stage for further conversation. Over to you, Vinny. The baton is on with you.
Okay. We have questions.
Yes, we'll have a short because we ran out of time for this. But we'll have 5 minutes.
So okay. So I've taken a slightly different tack. I mean, I don't come from the scholarship that most of you around this table have. I've worked in industry, and I'm taking a shot at my sort of predictions at a high level based on this. When I sat down to think about it, I've taken a medium-term impact outlook under the assumption that A, the markets will stay preoccupied with rate hikes and quantitative tightening in the US. Nobody's paying any attention to what's happening in Ukraine. China will stay inward looking till October. China stays inward looking till October, till Mr. Jinping gets re-elected for life. Evolution of COVID will continue to be an unknown. That's again something that can throw a spanner in all sorts of fashions. I suspect that this will continue to be a prolonged medium intensity war. I mean, so we talked about rationality with war. I think there is the definition of rationality can differ for different people. And I suspect Mr. Putin has his own definition of rationality. So he's protecting his corner. Likelihood is that this continues at a low intensity war in some form till the next big event happens. And for all its talking, the West will continue to provide support to Ukraine, but will never take decisive action. So so the first time around 2014, he did something, he got some land. It's probably will end up with him getting more land, and that's about it. So my view is that this is, from a business perspective, there is an impact right now, but that impact, the world will learn to live with it. And things will start coming back to normal in different ways. I believe that there will be certain areas where there will be meaningful changes. And I think I'll just focus myself on issues there. First, I think the innovation will reduce the immediate impact. I mean, so very quickly, so at a certain level, when we look at what's happening to Europe as far as energy is concerned, it's like basics of irrational thinking. You wanted to shut down your coal power plants, you wanted to shut down your nuclear power plants, so you outsourced the problem, you linked it to a country that you were not particularly friendly with, and yet you went ahead and got so dependent that you don't have a pathway out. I mean, for those of you who teach in business school and you talk of risk, I mean, this is the basic of risk management that you have, just forgotten. You just wiped it off and you kept going at it, right? The other element is that, but having said that, I mean, if you think of the reaction, within 2 months, RWE plus the German government have tied up 4 floating LNG platforms, which they say will cover them for 20% of their use. They have nuclear power plants that they've just shut down. There are another 3 that's supposed to shut down end of this year. Very much possible to bring it back. So I think the markets have overreacted in some ways. They will come back, and that realization will flow through to the markets. As I said, it will start looking a lot more like business as usual in 12 months' time. What may definitely change is the dynamics of the oil market. I mean, I looked up some statistics, and it's interesting that the amount of crude and gas that Russia sells and that China buys. I think if tomorrow the 2 of them get into a compact which says you give me discounted crude and gas and I tie it in for a long time, I mean, it could really change the nature of the market. I mean, as of 2020, China bought 1/3 of Russia's crude and only 6.5% of Russia's gas exports. And yet it only accounted for 1/6 of China's crude purchases and 3.5% of China's gas purchases. So if you think about it, China could start, if the logistics could work out, and it doesn't take more than a year or a couple of years to get that worked out. China could buy all of what Russia produces and yet be buying from elsewhere. What would prevent China from agreeing to a 25% discount and shaking hands? I mean, nothing prevents it. And interestingly, I mean, we don't think about it on a day-to-day basis because these are 2 countries that are sort of parceled off from the rest of the Western world. They have pipelines in place. They're working on pipelines that will treble the capacity in 3 years' time. So some of these are at various stages of execution. Crude, I mean, as with global warming, the Arctic ports open up. I mean, China has been dying to use the northern route in any event. And so it sort of starts fitting in beautifully. So what that could do is if China and Russia and India and Russia create another cabal, US is in any event self-sufficient now and an exporter. It leaves actually the rest of the world to struggle with. So it effectively, you will break up the global crude market into potentially multiple crude markets. And that could have interesting geopolitical impacts, I suspect. Now, I'm not a specialist on it, but I do feel that that potentially has an impact somewhere out there. Wheat, I think, is an area that in the immediate term is an impact. But again, they've already started shipping wheat out of Ukraine so the Black Sea ports are shut, but they're using trains now. So the world will figure out a way. I mean, it's unfortunately a product that does not have a substitute. Finally, I think potassic fertilizers is the area that is another one that will start impacting and will have bigger impact because places like Brazil depend entirely on Belarus and Russia for the supplies. And that part is likely getting locked away for a while. So 1/3 of 29%, I think 30% of exports of potassic fertilizers in 2020 was from Belarus and Russia. So that piece goes off, yes. And it's a natural resource-based product, so difficult to replace. Yes, definitely there's going to be deglobalization and implications for supply chain management. We talk of semiconductors. I mean, I'm sure people around the world are thinking, can we rely on Taiwan as the primary producer of high-end semiconductors? Okay. I think the status of the US dollar will get eroded, and partly it's the US to blame. They're overusing the whole sanctions bogey. And I think they're forcing people The reason they still stay preeminent is because of the TINA factor. If China was to decide tomorrow to make its currency freely convertible, I think the US dollar has serious challenger out there. From an India perspective, I think India should make the most of it. You can cut down your energy bill. You can enter into new markets that have been vacated by the Western companies. You could start exporting grains if you wanted to, opportunistically. The developing countries as a whole are going to suffer. I mean, I fully agree with Dipanshu's point. The West, I actually feel, will eventually end up in a better position over the medium term. Because one, they will spend more on defense. Two, they will have to spend more on energy infrastructure. And that will, in effect, start making up for the, provide an additional stimulus, which will sort of offset the increasing rate related issues that they're having. And finally, I think it's also an opportunity for Europe. This is their opportunity to take serious action on climate change. The fact is that we are seeing a lot of talk around climate change, but private capital is not willing to put it up in scale. Governments don't want to put in that capital because it does not look good. And so this crisis actually provides an opportunity for governments in Europe to say, this is desperate situation for us, etc., and therefore we will write a check from the EU or write a check from the sovereign to kickstart that process. And it's only once they kickstart the process, then potentially private capital will come in. Because the energy transition is going to be a meaningfully expensive affair for the world. And we are seeing a lot of talk, but no capital coming in. So I've covered a range of topics. Happy to take any questions later on. Sure.
So I would like to invite Professor Julian Perret. Professor Perret is out of Alliance University, Bangalore. He's an expert on post-Soviet world, and he's spent many years both in the.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today and to take part in this very international panel, since we have Indian representative, Swiss representative, Russian, Ukrainian, and French for me. I will not dare to ask you to pronounce the famous now Ukrainian or Russian word Palyanitsa, to know from which side of the conflict you are, same as the front line in Ukraine, in the Donbass now. So I'm not a pure economist, so I will bring maybe more civilizational approach, a more political and civilizational input. And I would like to draw your attention to the extreme resilience of Russian economy in this Ukrainian crisis. Because actually you have probably noticed that since at the beginning of the war, Russia's inflation increased very fast. But now Russian economy is already back on its feet. And most of Western economists were predicting the imminent collapse of Russian economy, but actually it did not happen at all. And it even defied all the predictions of the main Western and especially European economists. And the embargoes imposed by the US and its allies actually failed by many aspects. Since the Russian ruble is now as valuable as before the beginning of the conflict. The Russian ruble is even such valuable that it has been introduced illegally, obviously, in the occupied territory in the eastern part of Ukraine. As you know, the first round of sanctions had an immediate effect at the beginning of the conflict. But then very fast, the Russian economy recovered and became even immune. And it even gave some idea to the Chinese partners of the Kremlin, of the Russian government. Since a few days ago, the Chinese government launched a stress test on its own economy to know if in the future, the Chinese Popular Republic would be able to survive to some massive Western economic sanctions in case of growing conflict, growing tension with NATO member states. So the Western sanctions were intending to cut the Russian Federation from the world economy, to destroy the Russian economy, and to bring so much pain to the Russian people that they will turn against the Russian leadership and overthrow their government. I come from a country, France, in which our minister of economy officially said that the main goal of the sanctions was to lead a war, an economic war against Russia, and bring down the Russian economy. If you remember, Moscow is now subject to more than 6,000 different targeted restrictions. That is more than Iran, Venezuela, Myanmar, and Cuba combined all together. And Russia has faced an unprecedented package of sanctions from the US and its allies since the beginning of the conflict. And the Russian banks have been removed from SWIFT. The Russian central bank experienced a lot of sanctions. Also, the value of the ruble fell 30% at the beginning of the conflict against the US dollar. But during the month of March, only 1 month after the beginning of the conflict, the Russian ruble was already gradually recovering, and it was already back to its pre-war value of more or less 80 rubles for $1. So even if around 350 foreign investment companies have fled Russia, including luxury and retail sectors, even if more than 150 companies such as BP, Exxon, Shell, Renault, French car constructor, for example, had halted their engagement in the Russian market, and even if many pro-NATO entertainment industry companies such as Netflix, Disney, and even porn websites such as OnlyFans have stopped participating in the Russian market, all these sanctions have failed in a global way. And this is the main reason why, by the way, the European Union is currently preparing a sixth package of new sanctions against the Kremlin. And all these sanctions failed, and it is very interesting because Vladimir Putin himself called this successive package of sanctions an economic blitzkrieg against Russia. He merely used this term from the Second World War, from the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, to define the role of these Western sanctions to punish the Russian geopolitical adventure in Ukraine. And the goal of this sanction was to seriously undermine the financial and economic situation in Russia, to provoke some kind of panic in the markets and to trigger a banking collapse, maybe. But it failed. And it failed because the Central Bank of Russia managed to support Russian citizens. The government supported a rise of the pensions and the social payments in general. And the Kremlin helped to raise all the social payments, to maintain and raise all the social payments in general. And I would even say that these Western sanctions have even backfired on the countries that introduced them, especially the European countries, because in countries such as Germany, France, or Italy, they led to a spike in inflation and unemployment in the weeks after they have been introduced. So the standard of living in Russia has fallen a little bit, but the standard of living in the European Union is also currently falling, and it is something very interesting in my opinion, because you know, the European Union, the main objective of the European Union in all these packages of sanctions used to depend on a very strange conviction, the conviction that the Russian energy sector was some kind of a monopsony. You know, a monopsony, it's when on the market there is only one single buyer. Brussels bureaucrats, Paris bureaucrats, or Berlin bureaucrats tend to believe that if they bring down Russian economy, they will save democracy, and they will be able to find gas from other countries very easily. They can stop Russian gas imports and switch to American LNG gas import, for example, which is, by the way, very costly, and that will cost a considerably higher price than the Russian gas in Europe. And the problem is that the European powers tend to forget that for more than 10 years, the Russian Federation has considerably changed its logistical supply chain, especially in energy. And it changed to Asia, to Asian countries, mainly China. You know, the colossal gas agreement between Beijing and Moscow, $400 billion. But a few weeks ago, at the peak of the conflict, Beijing and Moscow signed another agreement, for a 30-year agreement for $120 billion for the 30 next years. And we could also include India. We could also include Pakistan, Vietnam, and in general, the ASEAN member state of Southeast Asia. So as you perfectly know, and you all know better than I do, since you are a specialist in economy, and I'm just an amateur in comparison, you can impose sanctions if there is a surplus in the market. But at the opposite, as Professor Amar perfectly said concerning the neon shortage for chips, concerning the energy, it is the same. There is a shortage. So Russia is simply making more money, actually, by sending its supplies to Asia, and even at a discount price. Through gas pipelines such as Force of Siberia and the new expected pipeline from Sakhalin Island to connect the Russian gas industry in Sakhalin to China. And at the opposite, in the European Union, if they don't want to buy Russian gas, it's not such a big issue now for the Russian Federation, because they have some other potential buyers in Asia. And Nord Stream, for example, the Nord Stream 2, the second gas pipeline, is now currently used by Gazprom not to supply gas to Central Europe, but to supply gas to northwestern part of Russia. I think that energy is a very interesting issue to better understand the geopolitical Russia's pivot to Asia since 2011, 2012, more or less, because for already 10 years, Russia is looking to the east and is not looking anymore to the west. And the Russian Federation considers that the European Union and NATO countries, including the USA, of course, are not reliable partners anymore, including
Professor Julian, 1 minute.
Thank you. So I will just yes, I would like you just to draw your attention on this geopolitical pivot of the Russian Federation to Asia, to China, to India. That is the first step, in my opinion, to a process of de-dollarization of the world. And as you know, the Central Bank of Russia is now preparing a new kind of ruble, a new kind of currency that would be not only based on dollars, but based on gold-backed, and maybe also based on energy payments. And in order to switch from a very evanescent dollar in the international market to more solid commodities such as new technologies and energy supplies.
Okay, thank you. To summarize, what I see is that Russia is at a very strategic position where its core trade is linked to the core interest of many of the affected nations, and therefore sanctions may not have a very strong impact. Therefore, the international trade may not be impacted as we might perceive at the moment. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions. We'll take only 4 questions, and then we'll move to the next panel. Some of the questions are already there on the chat box. I'll take 2 questions, and then Professor Ship, Professor, you have a question? Okay, so let me take the questions that are already mentioned in the chat box. First one is from Professor Thibault. If India expands its trade with Russia, is there a possibility of it walking into the same trap as Germany is currently because of its energy imports? Okay, then we have questions from Professor Tej Pawan. Vineet, it's to you, Professor Vineet. China and Russia oil pacts are very interesting. Wonder if India's inclusion in that are more India's perspective than necessarily material from the other 2 players' views. I don't know what the question. I mean, you might want to address this question. Then we have another question from Tej Pawan. Would love to hear your thoughts on what the net impact of all these issues on green economy transition spending, which I thought was a very good question, and the point that you raised. Example, governments be able to spend enough for this given rising defense spends and nearer term fossil fuel alternate sourcing pressures? Well, it could be. Pavel, do you have any questions? Pavel, Kamian, do you have any questions for us? Any comments? You're on mute, Pavel. Pavel, you're on mute.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I would like to share my thoughts with you. We don't see, as you said, and we are here too in Russia, nobody understands what's the truth picture of what is happening. Sanctions doesn't work. This means that the representation of Russia economy and the global economy is wrong. And nobody have a solution. No in Europe, no in America, and no in Asia. And I think the reason is our institutions, which creates a war mindset. Every thought, every attempt to comprehend the situation turns to be as a weapon in info war. So the situation is very difficult right now, and I see it gonna be worse. I know that I work in business school, Skolkovo, and we trying to analyze the situation as well as you. And this situation in economy is very bad, and I don't understand how it can be solved unless we find a way to establish dialogue, communication, and understanding of the other party. And but for now, there are no such institutions. World security institutions, state institutions, and media institutions doesn't work. That's it, Anirudh. Thank you for the invitation.
By the way, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Pavel is from Skolkovo Business School in Moscow. Thank you. Thanks, sir. Professor Sukumar, you have a question as well?
Yeah, I think I'll leave it up to it in my session.
Okay,
because we're running short of time.
Thank you.
Can I make a question and an observation on what you just said about technological transformation saving the day? But you see, there are a lot of sunk cost in this infrastructure. I mean, what would be the effect on the economies of the smaller European countries if they are to make this sudden transition? Also, Germany, the nuclear power plants, you see, they have not, even before they stopped it, they have not actually made any investment in them for at least 15, 20 years. So these are obsolete technologies and probably unsafe. Some of them might be. So how will this sudden transformation happen? I mean, how fast can it happen?
I'll first address Professor Gandhok's question. So Professor Gandhok, I mean, you're an Australian. So the unsaid part of China's desire to tie up with the Russians would also be the fact that your Gorgon oil gas fields in Australia account for 40% of China's natural gas purchases at this point of time. And the Australians, on the other hand, are going and getting into AUKUS Pact and all sorts of stuff. I am sure China is learning its lesson from Germany and saying, if tomorrow I do something with Taiwan, I don't want to have a 40% dependence on Australian gas. So I mean, it's not just the money motive. I think there are other motives that China would love to, get into a compact with Russia. As far as India is concerned, India should ideally want to piggy ride, because from a cost perspective, it does not necessarily work for India, because you cannot lay a pipeline through Afghanistan and hope that it works. I mean, you don't have a direct connectivity to Russia. And if you are bringing it all the way around Asia, then you might as well buy it from Venezuela and Brazil. So I mean, from a distance perspective, it doesn't work. But for India, it would be a purely what in India we would say baniyagiri. If you give it to me for something for 25% less, I will buy it. And I think that's what India's point of view should be. It will get help if the oil market gets broken. I mean, if Iran is already selling to China, Saudi Arabia, which was so much in the US camp, is now saying we also want to sell in yuan. And as somebody else was talking about of coming up with currencies which would principally be on the barter principle, using different commodities. India would find, if there is a desire, will find ways to get to it. So I hope that answers your question on the China-India issue around that.
I just had a quick follow-up question, if I may. I put that in the chat as well. I was just wondering, I mean, are gas pipelines still viable? I mean, just like new coal power plants and new coal mine projects are usually not viable anymore, given what, renewable energy is done.
I get it. I mean, I think the issue really is that the world is, so you've got this wokeness around renewable energy, if you may permit me to say that. And you have driven away capital such that your traditional energy sources are not even getting capital to maintain production. So you basically decided one day that I will go straight from a fixed line telephone to 5G without thinking through the ramifications of the pathway. And I think that's part of the reason why oil markets have reacted so violently, because if you take almost any large producer of crude, they are seeing production come down. One, because obviously they cherry pick the fields, but two, also because they don't have access to capital. And I think that is an issue that the world needs to resolve at some level. I mean, so as things stand, we have to believe that innovation will win the day. But we have some very big questions of how to store energy generated from renewable sources in a meaningful way. Do our networks support it? The whole so we are willing to build an infrastructure for hydrogen, for example, theoretically. All of those questions need to be answered as well. And essentially, I think there is agreement that you will have to do carbon sequestering. Again, technology that's untried. So you cannot, destroy your way of life in the hope that, I mean, that's my take. I think the world will have to find a way to put capital into play. And between China and Russia, it's an interesting twosome. If the two leaders decide that this pipeline needs to go up, it will go up. I mean, let's be very clear about that.
A couple of quick points here. I hope these are still relevant because the conversation has gone in a particular direction. But first of all, the table that was shown at the beginning showing Russian revenue from energy products in the first part of 2022, it actually, it's not telling very much of the Indian story. Just to see India as a very small item very down at the bottom of the list doesn't tell very much of the story at all, because the fact of the matter is that the average import of Russian oil into India all of last year on average was something like 35,000 barrels per day. As of the middle of last month, it was 700,000 barrels per day. Okay, so even if that's a fairly small part of India's energy overall, it's I wouldn't call it a distortion, but it's certainly a major adjustment to the way India consumes energy. So there's going to be some repercussions of that, no matter what solutions are found. And I can't imagine, well, I mean, you know, one wonders, of course, who's going to profit from this. I mean, now India has supposedly the world's largest oil refinery in Gujarat. So we all know who's would benefit from re-exporting Russian oil from India. But I'm not really sure what my point is here, except that, you know, that table is really rather misleading about what the situation is for India. So
no, but I have to clarify because it's a data point I've put out there. So the point there was to make that I think in lot of the conversation, and this is something which the foreign minister in India made observation. I'm on one of the points. I'm on one of the sides of what the foreign minister made, which is, I think a lot of the conversation is solely focusing on what India is doing and not doing, as against to understanding what countries within Europe has been doing in terms of their own existing endowments and relationships with respect to trade with Russia. So why the chart or why the data point? And that's why I excluded the conversation in India by talking about India's trade and relationship in a separate set of slides. I think if we would have more time, we could have broken down onto the extent to which India has been reliant, largely in energy and defense. The troubling point is to the entire conversation is India has been very explicit in expanding its role with respect to its energy purchasing from Russia, and has almost taken a moral position that it doesn't really care about what's happening in Ukraine. I'll be honest here. And that's the point, that's the fear that a lot of us had, that this has a significant social cost for democracy and democratic countries. If you make a silent stance on a public position where a position of neutrality is put in or painted, along with that of quote unquote strategic autonomy, there's not much of strategic autonomy that I'm seeing there when it comes to the relationship in terms of economic ties. That's point number one. Second, we have to say this because this is going into the conversation on law. What is the moral, amoral, or ultra-realist position of India's foreign policy stance at the moment? We do not know India's position and stance when it comes to China. Is not much discussed publicly at all. We know very little about what our strategic position is in the next medium to long term when it comes to our own partnerships, whether it's with the Quad, the non-Quad, tie-ups within the Indo-Pacific region. We have been, in my sense, more reactionary than ever before. And what it does is it exposes our macroeconomic positions quite widely, which makes it a total sense that from 35,000 barrels, you move to 700,000 barrels in a matter of almost a very short temporal span, because you saw an opportunity, an economic opportunity to take as much of cheap Russian oil because you see a potential for doing so. The troubling point for the Indian citizen is none of this cost has been passed on to the Indian middle-class citizenry. Two, why? We're not in an election year. Second, most of our fuel cost hike is fueled in by tax increases that the central government has done, for which no revenue is passed on to the states. The states have been doing their own taxes. A lot of these issues are connected. Of course, under the ambit on the scope of the panel discussion, I think we can look into it. But I was responding to what Dennis was saying earlier. on that particular data point.
Sure. If you'll allow me just one more quick intervention, just on the general point of sanctions. Thing about history of sanctions and embargoes is very checkered if one looks over the past even 70, 80 years, right? For every case where, say, US embargo of Japan in the late 1930s and 1940, pushed Japan into war against the United States, there are very few spectacular cases of sanctions or embargoes, at least for large and medium-sized economies, actually having some dramatic effect. Again, the US embargo of Cuba is a rather different case. That's meant ruin. Well, it's certainly meant a very different kind of life for Cubans over the past 60 or 70 years. But I mean, when one thinks of, attempts to embargo South Africa by Western economies in the 1970s and 80s, very mixed results. In the early 1980s, in solidarity with Solidarność in Poland, the Solidarity movement and so on, that really didn't have much impact. And, Western economies continued to invest very heavily in Eastern European economies. That's a separate point, but I won't get to it. But, you look at the scale of Western investment in Hungary, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia in the 1970s and 80s, that's where a huge amount of Western economic growth was coming from. So this actually goes back to what Anirudh was saying, kind of, I thought, maybe misapprehension about superpower bipolarity and what it means closing off economies. That was certainly not the case in the world in the 1970s and 80s, because both blocs had really adjusted significantly to that political reality. And there was certainly more Western investment in Eastern Europe by the early 1980s than there was Russian investment. So it's, they didn't actually behave as two separate blocks economically by any means. Yeah.
Shall I take over, Anirudh, because we are more than an hour talking and we
Yes.
have two more panels. Probably it's a good time.
Sincere apologies, Professor Wesley.
No
The
problem.
floor is for
Let's
you.
go.
Please.
Actually, we will be talking in a similar vein. We will also talk about sanctions, geopolitical redistribution in the world. So let's go to the second panel, and I suggest to start with, I don't see, is Suvrayogji Gupta in the room there? He's present.
Yeah.
No, then Thibault. Let's go to Thibault and Tanya Kuchetko.
I'm here, Professor Vis.
You're there. Okay.
Yeah.
Suvrajyoti, your time, please.
Thank you. The last panel was amazing. On that note, let us now move to the question of law, right? So we saw the effect on business, but I believe that whatever is the effect on international trade and business over a period of time, it will balance itself. But the effect that this war is going to have on international law, that might actually be more long lasting. So the topic that I have today, I call my lecture, it's the coup d'etat against international law, right? So if you look into the Ukrainian war, I mean, I'm calling it a war, but Russians call it special military operations, whatever that means. So Russia has set out 3 casus belli, which is apparent from their statements given at various points of time. The proximate cause of war is a supposed genocide in the Donbas region caused by supposed Nazis who are present in Ukraine. Then the second cause of action is the eastward expansion of NATO. The third one, which is even further away, which is it seems that Putin and the Russian rulers now consider Ukraine to be an artificial state. So I will sort of address all these things. First of all, on the first and the proximate cause of war, which is genocide, let me point out that these genocide claims are not given with any facts and circumstances. For example, when there's Kosovo war, there were satellite images available showing mass graves. I mean, there were definite proofs of actions happening on ground. So this is some vague and ambiguous claim that was put forward there. Now, also Nazis, there are definite far-right groups in Europe, but they do not seem to be of that influence which can trigger such a war. And of course, this actually, I mean, it's nobody's case that there are any elements of a humanitarian intervention there, that something immediate was about to happen. The second and the more important, I would say, cause of war is the eastward expansion of NATO. Now, this was never put forward as a direct cause of the war. I would point out as to why this was not done so. But obviously, this was actually set out as a more strategic reason, long-term strategic reason why this hostilities came to be. So if I was a lawyer for Russia, I would point out certain things that have happened in that region. First, I would point out to the statement that was made by James Baker to Gorbachev in 1990, that the borders of NATO will not move beyond Germany. Now, it seems that Russians have considered it to be a pledge that NATO is not going to move into East Europe. But the Americans have considered this. I mean, James Baker himself said that I never gave anybody any such assurance. But the American understanding was more confined to Germany. Whatever was the case, there's an entire literature, there's an entire narrative, which is, I think, more focused in Russia, which says that it's a narrative of kind of stabbing in the back, betrayal, like you gave us a promise and we acted accordingly. You did not keep your part of the bargain. Right. And if I was a Russian, I would continue with that. I would say that all the East European countries joined NATO when Russia was actually quite docile. So they joined NATO during Yeltsin time, when Russia was actually kind of trying to become a Western country. It was trying. I mean, it was not becoming, but it was trying. Vladimir Putin comes only in 1999, and he actually, I believe, takes the center stage not before 2002. So all this have happened before that. There is no threat. So from the Russian point of view, that this was a power projection move by the US, and it was a prestige move by the Eastern European nation who wanted to be the prestige of being in NATO without actually a security threat. Now, I would use this in two ways. First, I would say that if this is the case, if nobody's words mean anything, and these declarations made, the statements made to heads of state have no normative value, then everything that has happened in Europe since the post-Soviet, since the fall of Soviet Union, is actually just a series of moves on a diplomatic maneuvers on a checkboard. They have no legal or normative value. In that case, the security guarantee given to Ukraine also does not stay. None of the other treaties also stay. Of course, US has gone further. They have also withdrawn from the ABM Treaty in ABM Treaty 1972 in, I think, during second Bush years, which is 2002, right? And the IRBM Treaty, they also withdrew from 2019, supposedly responding to Russian threats. I mean, that remains open. So this has the effect of materially altering the strategic balance that existed in Eastern Europe. Now, so if I'm a Russian patriot, I would say that a NATO expansion is a part of a wider power move, and it is creeping to Russian border. And at any point of time, they would make an escalatory move. And my move to attack Europe, I mean, to enter into Ukraine, is basically an anticipatory self-defense, and anticipatory self-defense is probably allowed under Article 51. This would be, I mean, narrative-wise, a very powerful argument, but not so much legally, perhaps, because you see, the right of anticipatory self-defense, I mean, the international Article 51, as I mean, a plain reading of it is very clear, actually. It's a blanket prohibition on use of force, to use violence as a mode of dispute resolution, right? Anticipatory self-defense, as understood by the Webster principle, is instant, overwhelming, and leaves no means of moment of deliberation and a proportionate response, right? So a NATO expansion per se, NATO is what? NATO is just a sort of defensive organization, right? So, I mean, it's like many others that exist on this planet, like SCO, Quad, AUKUS. Then there is something called a non-NATO ally also, whatever that means, right? So just membership of these groups cannot bring about a right of anticipatory self-defense. It has to be some kind of a move. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, they actually deployed missiles, right? If they had actually, US had actually deployed some offensive weaponry in Europe, then that probably could have been made an argument. I do not see this NATO argument as legally powerful, but I think Russian commentators can answer this, but I think politically this has proved to be exceedingly powerful, especially in mobilizing Russian public opinion. It's something similar to what you had in Germany about in the First World War, that the troops were stabbed in the back by the politicians. Right. Now, the third point is, of course, that Ukraine is supposedly an artificial state. I don't really understand what is an artificial state, because all states are artificial to begin with. I mean, these are not like natural boundaries like that originate. So Russia has recognized Ukraine. They have signed a security memorandum with them. They had an ambassador there. They had reasonably good relations with them till 2014. So I do not know where this comes from. Having said all this, so what happens? So from the point of view of international law, from the point of view of liberal academics, right, we can deem the Ukraine war. I'm using the term war, but once again, it's perhaps more correctly as the Ukraine conflict, Ukraine invasion, as illegal. But then you see, there are bigger questions involved here, right? For example, when you call something as illegal, that's a normative category, right? Something becomes illegal when it is illegal as decided by the rules of adjudication. Now, what is the rules of adjudication here? Could be the ICJ, could be the Security Council, which lays down the law, right? So as my reading of the ICJ decision would be, it's just an interim order given on the point of genocide. And I would not call this a commentary on the legality of Russian actions. The Security Council, of course, failed to condemn Russia because there was a veto. And this veto is also legal, right? Legal as in how international law is organized today. So rules of adjudication, I mean, there is no warrant out against Russia as such. There is nothing which is proving that they are in violation of the law. So from the courts, we can move on to what Woodrow Wilson called the court of public opinion, right? You can look into the General Assembly resolutions. There are two of them, both condemn Russia. But even there, there are almost 39 countries that have actually either stayed, abstained, or voted for Russia. And they would probably, this include countries like India, Brazil, China. Together, they would account from some 45% of this planet's population, right? So if you look at a future historian, what would he say? He say that maybe the Russian actions were illegal as per the liberals or Western educated intellectuals, but there was no ruling as to that effect, right? There was no definite outcome to that effect, right? Now, this brings us to a wider question that what is international law and what is its relation with international order, right? What is international law? So you see, international society, unlike a domestic society, is not bound by any ties of ethnicity, language, or religion, right? The UNGA is not really a lawmaking body as such. You, for what we call international law, what you have is the practice of the states, some attitudes that the countries hold sacrosanct that you can call jus cogens norms, and of course, consensual rulemaking in terms of treaties, right? Now, if you have to change it, what do you do? And why do you want to change it? Of course, I mean, post Cold War, it was thought that all the world would turn liberal, everybody would be on the same page, it will be peace all over. That has not happened. So now in the international society, we have a large number of states which are disaffected, which wants major and significant change for various reasons, not necessarily for all good reasons. So Russia, China, India, Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, even Ukraine are part of that group. But there are three various attitude to this change. For one, change could also be slow consensus building and building multilateral institutions and methods. I call this the Ravenclaw method, right? You can also call it the prayer and petition method or politics method. So India has tried working with it, but I must say that be it climate change or trade, it has not really shown that great results. The second method is that of institutional capture from behind, which is the Slytherin method. You capture institutions, you corrupt institutions, you use your economic power to distort. So that method, China has been more successful. I mean, look into their how they got away with the whole COVID situation and their flagrant violation of the international health regulations, right? But nobody apart from China has been able to use it to that extent. It's certainly not Russia's cup of tea. So Russia uses what is called the Gryffindor method, which is just the fire and brimstone method, right? You try to destroy international law. Basically, you create a situation where there is more acceptance of a state practice involving use of force. Now, what is the significance of that? Use of force is basically a mode of disruption, right? You undermine the order, and that's what they want. So whether or not they attain their immediate objective in Ukraine, they have managed to attain their objective in vis-a-vis international law. They are amending it through force. They are stretching its bounds. I am not trying to make a moral point here. I mean, I do not know if this is the best way. I mean, I am not even sure if this is going to help Russia, because nothing Russia has done since 1917 has helped them. Everything has been for the worse, right? But then again, if I have to be a cynic, I'll point out that the present world system is actually based on the outcome of a war. So 1945, some people won a war and they just set up a system. So, I mean, something which is made with fire will always be subject to challenge by fire, right? And this is how I see this Russian war as. They are not, I mean, you cannot really use international law to hold them accountable because they are now shifting the goalpost itself, right? So that's my 2 cents. Thank you for your time.
Sovro. Thank you very much, Sovro. Now let's move to the next speaker, which is Thibault. Please, Thibault, your time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Okay. Why is my camera not working? 1 second. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. As part of my intervention here today, I do not really want to dwell on the justification for any eventual, the justification for this war and the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, if it is historically justified, is a matter of great dispute. And I think I would agree with Subrajyoti that legally these arguments are not very much convincing, right? Because you have to imagine also from a kind of treaty negotiation perspective, particularly in 1991, when the 2+4 system was discussed between the US and the USSR at that point, the USSR was not really in a position to demand any kind of concrete obligation, right? And so from a treaty negotiation perspective, it would be bizarre that particularly the United States, with whom negotiating treaties is very difficult, as even the European Union has witnessed with the TTIP treaty that didn't really work out. So it would have kind of been bizarre that the United States would have agreed to such an obligation in the absence of really any kind of leverage to make them accept it. But with that being said, today I want to focus on 2 points. My first point is that I want to reflect, is there a legal way out? Or was there a legal way to prevent this war from occurring in the first place? So we see that in the build-up to this war, from last spring to where there was already a significant build-up of troops on the border, to this fall when the build-up even accelerated and international diplomacy really kicked into a higher gear. Was there a possibility legally to have some kind of agreement to prevent this war? And The one problem that I see from international law is that, and this is notwithstanding also the concrete treaty proposals that Russia has made, which curiously were never directly addressed to Ukraine, but were rather addressed to Western European states as well as the United States and NATO in general, right? But could a treaty have with Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, have prevented this war? And this is from international law quite a clear answer, because we have in the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties a very clear provision that says that a treaty who is concluded under the coercion is null and void as per law. This is Article 52, right? And for a preventative treaty, let's say, this is really the final word. Now, nothing could have really superseded this norm. Maybe the Security Council, but as I'm going to, talk about also later, a little bit later, the Security Council's role would have really been difficult in this area, particularly because of Russia's permanent membership. So a preventative treaty is really out of the question, because Ukraine could have quite, easily have insisted that this is not binding afterwards for whatever reason. And also international partners, whatever states, could have said that we don't recognize the settlement because of the coercion. So what now? What if, and this is particularly a response also to a sentiment of pacifists in Western European states who kind of insist that we should not deliver weapons, we should make a quick peace so that we can go back to business as usual. It's a quite cynical position, given what has happened in Bucha and in Gostomel and in Chernihiv and Kharkiv. I mean, the crime scenes are too numerous to list them all here. But it's a cynical position. But the question remains, could a quick peace where Ukraine says, okay, we are going to surrender Crimea, we are going to surrender Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast for the states, and additionally, if the situation warrants, we would also surrender Kherson and the region. And the answer here is that such a treaty also, because it is concluded under the threat and subsequent to an armed attack, would not be valid. And this is a significant problem here in terms of international law, because there is one important distinction in this, obviously, that this rule of nullity of treaties conceded or concluded under the threat of coercion does not apply to armistices, right? So armistice treaties are, as per rule and quite logically excluded. We can see this in international law also from the situation and the case of Congo and Uganda, where we see that Congo and the surrounding nations, in particular Uganda, had concluded a ceasefire agreement, which were the Lusaka agreements, and the ICJ in the case has obviously not taken up this treaty and said that, oh, well, but this treaty has been concluded under the threat of the use of force or subsequent to an armed attack, and therefore it is, subject to coercion, and it should be considered null and void, right? So the problem lies here that
yes, one more minute and finish. Yes.
So just one quick point is that the problem here is that in order to end this war by treaty, as the pacifists in Europe demand, there would have to be some concession in the treaty for Russia in terms of territory, and that concession would render the treaty null and void. And so there's quite a discussion to be had here, whether then we can, through interpretative methods, say that, okay, the international legal community doesn't recognize the transfer of territories, but we recognize the armistice. But that's a big problem.
Good. Thank you very much, Thibaut. Excellent. And finally, but not least, we have Tatiana Kochetkova in this panel. So Tatiana, your time. Go ahead. Thank you.
So I want to address two issues. One is the impact of the situation, possible impacts and strategies and scenarios of how it may impact the climate change mitigation, because that's a topic I have been working. So it has been briefly raised, I think, by Professor Surayoti. And another is the geopolitical cultural perspective on this conflict. So Professor Thibault has said, like, whether the question, I want to address this question, whether there was a legal way to prevent the war or to stop the war. I think the answer is negative, and I would say why. Because there was already agreement about the Russia being a guarantee for the peace in Ukraine and for the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, which was broken by the invasion. So in my view, first of all, it's very important to differentiate between the country and the regime. So somebody said, like, speaking from point of view of Russian patriot, I would ask which patriot? Patriot of the country or patriot of the regime? Because in this case, some of my Russian colleague intellectuals and friends say that we have internal occupation. So that Putin's regime is occupied the country. That because many, actually, if Russia was liberated from Putin's regime, this would do good to the country as a total, because in fact, the legal address and the attempt to resolve international issues with the rule of law relies on the liberal democratic view of the world, the rule of law, democracy, human rights, so all these values which we share since Enlightenment, European Enlightenment. At the same time, what the current regime, which is led by Putin, presents the autocracy, which has the will of the leader, decides everything. So basically, it falls under the definition of the regime, which is military aggressive, in which the human rights are not respected and the policy is strictly regulated by the elite. So this kind of regime, it does not recognize its law as a language. It does not speak legal language. It speaks the language of the interests, my interests, your interests, and it turns off the what have been politics in the 20s and 30s years of the 20th century. So in the 1930s and the 1920s. And the sudden, it is a tragedy. This war is a tragedy, I think, for both sides. And it creates impression that we are suddenly like 100 years back in history, because we saw that we have left it all behind, that we live in a world which is ruled by principles of ethics, law based on ethics and international agreements, high technologies, international cooperation, and suddenly this is all gone. Suddenly we have two camps. The camp is pro-liberty and democracy, and the camp which is for autocracy. And unfortunately, current Russian regime is in the autocracy camp together with China. So basically, that's the situation now. And nobody can, I cannot see the future. Maybe somebody can, but I don't know, but it's difficult. So depending on the outcome of the war, one may say of the possibility of return to the bipolar world order, which was a new Cold War, which is currently seems to be going on with two world centers and correspondingly economy also being split between these two world centers, and economic relations also heavily impacted by this. So this is indeed a tragic situation, but concerning the Russia had a chance of going towards democratic solution in the 1990s. But unfortunately, with Putin's coming to power, and once Putin said on one of his early 90s that once KGB agent, forever KGB agent. So Putin has been KGB agent, and this path to democracy, this window of opportunity which Russia had to become a prosperous, liberal, and democratic country, for the time being, it did not realize. I don't exclude this possibility in the future. Maybe it will still become after the demise of Putin's regime. But at the moment, this is not just war between Russia and Ukraine. At the moment, this is a question of values, of ethics, and what world order do we want? Do we want the world order which is ruled by law, by respect to human rights, by equality, or we want the world order which is again ruled by the powerful is the one who the power is the right? So that's currently the question. And concerning the climate change mitigation, which is the point is that world under the leadership of United Nations Panel of Climate Change, well, good or bad, but it was on the course to carbon zero emissions by 2050. And it has been on the course to resolving and mitigating climate issue on the green energy transition, which requires international cooperation, which requires technology transfer, which requires huge investments. And all countries, most of the world's countries have agreed in the Paris conference and supported by the Glasgow Agreement 2021, their national determined contributions, including India, to cooperate towards this goal. It was not perfect, it has been criticized, but it has been something, and it is something which is working. So it is a progress. The progress is obvious, even though we might have done more, but it is still quite essential contribution. And there is a big hope to keep the global warming under 2 degrees Celsius chance. Now, this war makes this chance much slimmer, unfortunately, because the investments which were needed for the green energy transition, now they will go into war, and now the short-term thinking will prevail over the long-term thinking. Now, for example, for Europe, the question is to find replacement for Russian oil and gas, and a fast-term, quick-term, short-term replacement. Unfortunately, we cannot, the possibility to think in long terms becomes more difficult because there is an immediate threat. So there is a possibility of US supplying crude oil to Western Europe, but this is being discussed, and this is not something certain. So Germany looking quickly for solutions, probably this would be nuclear power, which is also has its drawbacks, even though it has also advantages, but it has a drawbacks that in case of conflicts, in case of accidents, so it's good if everything goes as planned, but in case of accidents, nuclear power become even more source of danger. So unfortunately, there is a huge risk that this climate mitigation goals of 2 degrees Celsius and being carbon neutral by 2050 will be more difficult to meet now, because what they need is the Enlightenment values, rule of law, respect to human rights, equality, and cooperation, which is now being challenged. So, well, thanks.
Thank you, Tanya. Excellent. I'm very happy to hear from all three of you. And basically, let me give you a summary. In international law, there is no really a doubt that what happened in Ukraine is a clear aggression. The topic of our discussion is the Russian aggression. The name, the word aggression is mentioned in the UN General Assembly resolution supported by over 140 countries. So for the lawyers, and I wouldn't say for the Western lawyers, I think for any lawyers in India, if we ask our Jindal Law School faculty what they, that there will be 99% absolutely clear that this is an aggression. This is a crime of aggression. There are war crimes committed everywhere in Ukraine. So in a way, the picture is not kind of a very difficult to determine as a clear aggression of a big, powerful country against a weaker neighbor. So for that matter, I will say directly, sorry. Am I audible? My computer just. So for the international law, scholars, there is absolutely perfect clarity here. I agree with Suvro when he said that, yes, the Security Council, because of the Russian veto, the system is not perfect. We know this for many years. It's not the first time. Russia imposed several vetoes on resolutions on Syria, which led to another tragedy, which led to 12 million people being displaced in Syria. So it's not the first time when human tragedy happens because the Security Council is blocked by veto, and primarily in this case of Syria and Ukraine, more recently by the Russian veto. But that doesn't kind of remove the judgment that international law is very clear against the aggressor. This is absolutely no doubt. Ask any reasonable lawyer in the world, and the ICJ opinion also, I think it's a very strong one. The judgment of the world in the General Assembly, the judgment of the ICJ, again, I understand the limits of the international organizations, but the clarity, the language is absolutely there. Now, let me address something else which I heard from the previous discussion on the sanctions, and I think that's also very important. Again, somehow people were trying to say that, Russia didn't suffer from the sanctions enough. They have an alternative ways. They can sell gas and oil to China. India can buy. We hear this. However, there is also a point where states need to sacrifice something in their national interests as to show where they do stand in this, I will call it, battle between the evil and the victim. So it's no less than evil against the victim. And if we don't sacrifice a little bit of our money, interest, that's really put us in the wrong side of the history. And my country, little Bulgaria, sacrificed the gas supply. And we said to the Russians, we are not going to buy gas with rubles. The contracts say US dollar, we will pay in US dollar, we are not going to pay in rubles. Firmly as it is, and Russia stopped the gas supply to Bulgaria, which is, by the way, a good news. The immediate reaction of our economists was that we should do without the Russian gas. There are alternative sources. We should think about reducing the electricity consumption. We should buy gas from Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and everywhere else. This is the moment for countries to reorient the dependency on Russian oil and gas, and they do. Most of the European countries do. Here, I definitely disagree with Julian Parrott, who somehow takes a bit of a short-term difficulties in some European countries. But 5-10 years from now, no European country will depend anymore on Russian oil and gas. They will do very well on every alternative source. And the ultimate victim, economic victim here, will be the Russian population, unfortunately. I'm saying that because the Russian economy, you say, is not collapsing, is actually almost collapsing. The bank doesn't work. People cannot take cash from anywhere. They cannot change. And when you say the currency is back to normal, it is not back to normal. It's the Russian central bank imposing an artificial normalcy of 70 rubles per euro. This is not a market-based currency. It is simply an imposition of the government who wants Russians simply to pay less. So if somebody wants to sell $1, he shouldn't get 150, which is the black market. They should have 70 or 80. So this is absolutely artificial imposed currency rate, which doesn't depend on market and has absolutely no value here in terms of long-term economic benefit. Not to say that, in fact, people are thinking that Russian gas can be transported to China. That's another fantasy. Look at the territory, look at the geography, look at the logistics. I don't see in the next 5 to 6, 7 years how China will invest in pipelines through this huge territory from east of China. Bear in mind, the industrial part of China is not the western part neighboring Russia, it's eastern part. That's where you need the gas to be delivered. And it goes back to the western part of Russia. From west of Russia to east of China, it's half of the world. You need to bring trillions to make pipelines from Russia to China to reorient that trade. And I'm asking you, are you seriously thinking China will spend trillions to save Russia by buying its natural gas and oil? I'm not sure about that. China is a very egoistic player. They only think about money and return. And if it is more expensive to buy the Russian gas, they will never do that. So again and again, I'm not sure that the long-term perspective of the Russian aggression bring any positive signal for the Russian population. And basically the final kind of outcome here is that what Putin, Tanya made it perfectly clear here that President Putin, it's not Russia, President Putin doesn't talk the language of law. He doesn't talk the language of normalcy. He created fantasy. And Suvrov very well presented those fantasies, that there is kind of a genocide in Donbass, which Russia is trying to remedy, that there was some sort of promise of NATO not to be expanded east. Again, probably verbally, once James Baker may have said something back in 1990, that's not a legal agreement. There is no single legal document suggesting that NATO promised not to expand eastward. That was a verbal discussion 34 years ago that has absolutely no legal significance. So in a sense, Suvrov, you argue that the UN resolution doesn't have a clear legal force, but you take a conversation between Jim Baker and Gorbachev back in 90, you try to put there some kind of legal force. Absolutely not. There is no promise whatsoever at any moment in the last 32 years to not accept countries in Eastern Europe, and they volunteer to come into NATO. It's not that NATO has an agenda to expand and to threaten Russia. No way. The countries, democratic countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, Estonia, the Baltic states, they are those, Slovenia, Croatia, they volunteer to join a defensive organization for very good reason, exactly for them not to happen what Ukrainian situation tells us today. By the way, no single bullet came to Russian territory from NATO for the last 75 years. No single bullet, no single centimeter of Russian territory has been invaded by any NATO member. So why do you believe Putin telling you that there is some sort of threat to Russia from NATO? It's an imagination, it's a fantasy. It doesn't exist. He's creating stories to make his people in Russia believe in those fantasies as to remain in power. The only reason Putin does is to stay in power. He has no other agenda. He knows he's gone because of the economic collapse. He knows that Russia one day will rise up and remove him, and his place in the history is where Hitler place in the history is. He knows that. And that's why he manipulates Russian population through the propaganda machine. He lies to everybody in the world, exactly, because he doesn't understand what is democracy. He doesn't understand what is rule of law. He cannot believe that one Ukrainian president can give the power to another Ukrainian president. Why should somebody after 4 years step back and give the power to another? In his brain, this doesn't work. Because in his brain, it is to stay in power forever, for 25, 30 years, and to grab as much material possessions as possible, and to encircle himself with the loyal dogs and pets who will repeat what he says. Let's look at the picture here. And when you say big countries are also supporting Russia, well, it's China with $1.5 billion, but they are not supporting Russia. not the Chinese, the Communist Party. Again, big countries might be neutral, but that's exactly countries. You look at who are those countries. Who are the countries who voted with Russia? North Korea, Belarus, Syria. Well, the murderers supported another murderer. It's very clear. So let's name it. Let's tell it. Finally, I would like to say that in a sense, Europe continued executing the contracts because they are already signed back in December, back last year. And many people kind of blame Europe for continuing to fuel the war by paying back for the supplies of gas and oil, simply because the Europeans are law-abiding contractors. The companies Europe continue to finish those gas and oil supplies. So, and again, I'm not blaming them. Exactly, somebody put a picture that Germany still pays a lot of gas and oil. That's normal because they need to execute to finish those contracts, but they clearly said they are not going to do this in the long future. So I'm saying gradually, Europeans will move out of Russia. And I strongly argued in an article we just published a few days back that India should do the same. I don't understand why India continues to rely on Russian imports. They should reorient the supplies, including the weapons, not least because Russians cannot produce those weapons anymore. The factories will not be able to do that anymore because of the fact that a lot of the replacement parts cannot reach Russia. How are you going to pay for those weapons? If the Russian ruble, are you going to change your rupees into Russian rubles to pay for the weapons if you have other alternative markets? Again and again, I don't see a longer term dependency on Russia in the benefit of any economy in the world, including India. And moreover, it is, as Dipanshu said earlier, it is very disturbing to see that India, the biggest democracy in the world, still is hesitating between the aggressor and the victim and doesn't take a clear stand, which also kind of talks about the future geopolitical role of those countries. One day from now on, exactly the opposite what Julian Parrott said. I would say historically, if we look back in those days, 10 years later, we will see very much who is collaborationist with Russia and who stand firmly, even against some sacrifices and losses, as to oppose the aggressor. Thank you. Let's go for the questions now. Anirudh, if you see some hands, because I'm, yes, let's see some questions.
Yeah, please. Come, take the mic.
Please come, it's supposed to be recorded, so we can hear you, but they...
Okay. I'm a third-year student of JSIA, International Affairs. The first example that comes to my mind when talking of interventions based on the seeming fear of something that isn't real is that of the United States, given that its anti-communist agenda that it used to intervene in several countries. So my question was, isn't Russia then doing what it's doing right now by taking advantage of the precedent set by the United States? And in extension to that, doesn't this then start a new world order, considering that the US-led world order was and is already seeing a decline, and coupled with the fact that US has been ineffective in taking stronger actions when such interventions have taken place recently, even in the global South, and now when it's hitting close home to in the West itself. So that was one of my...
Thank you. Anybody wants to answer that?
Legally, I have just...
I can briefly give my opinion on this. Yes, you're right that not every time when there is a humanitarian catastrophe, when there is a civil war, the West or the United States acted in the same way. I understand the kind of a double standard criticism that we wish always to have a strong moral voice and immediate intervention to stop aggressions and to stop war crimes. It doesn't happen all the time, I agree. But let me tell you, 40, 50 years back, there was a single standard of non-intervention. Whatever happened, we don't care. It's far away. It's not in my interest. Let them die. That was the single standard of 50, 60 years back. We don't want that. We prefer the double standards where you can intervene and stop half of the atrocities, rather than to go back to the single standard of total ignorance, cynicism, and non-intervention. Of course, as I said earlier, the world is not perfect, not ideal. Hopefully one day in the future, we will have a single standard of intervention, stopping atrocities, and let the dictators go where they need to go. We are still not there, but the half work is still better than zero effort. Next question.
Can I also say something?
Yes, Timo.
I think just on the point of double standard criticism, I think obviously there are often, double standards, but I think in this case, you could also make the argument that the double standard criticism actually works against the United States, right? Because we usually often talk about foreign interventions by the US, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya are the most recent examples, right? But what is little known is in the 1920s, the amount of interventions by the Red Army in its periphery to prevent democratic states from occurring. So you have Bashkortostan in the 1920s, you have the Red Army intervention in Azerbaijan, you have the Baltic states, you have the more famous examples of Czechoslovakia and Hungary, right? So I wouldn't really argue that there is any double standard at play. I would argue that, great powers oftentimes in their vicinity will interfere in the internal affairs of other states to secure their interest. And that is unfortunately, just a description of the reality, and I don't think that this has to do with any double standards. If at all, somebody mentions double standards, usually has to do with the fact that some interventions are more well known than others. And the reason for that, I cannot give you why
Okay,
they are
thank
more
you,
known.
Thibaut. I see other hands up. Let's take more questions. Thank you. Yes, please speak to the microphone if you're in the room or unmute.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because I often encounter this question in a course I teach. It starts with this question whether there is a theory of international relations, and it goes on to a question whether there's anything known as international law, because effectiveness of law depends on some measure, some means, institutional means of enforcing it. And enforcing it also means that the sanctions that are conceived must have some impact to achieve a desired end, to correct a perceived wrong. And here, of course, we've discussed the sanctions, and they don't seem to be, there are differences of opinion, but at this time, I'm referring to the Economist recent editorial, which says that the Russian economy is back where it was before the war started. The ruble is back where it was at the time that the war started. So sanction, whether or not they'll bite, of course, we can't kind of predict the future. There could be a meltdown also in the days ahead, days and months and weeks ahead. But so the question is there a thing known as international law?
Yes.
That takes to the question, to the work, very famous work in international relations by E.H. Carr, written between World War I and II. Euro between
20
the wars,
years crisis,
in which he says, in which he says that there are just recurring cycles of balance of power, right?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as an international law.
Well,
there are successive cycles of balance of power. And here we should pay attention to signals that the world order did not suddenly collapse on February 25th when Russia sent its troops across the border. If you look at the Munich Security Conference, the annual event held, which has become something of a fixture in the global strategic dialogue, in 2015, the title of the conference was "Collapsing Order, Reluctant Guardians." Right? Collapsing order, reluctant guardians. Last year, it was Westlessness. That, you know, the whole value system of the West is now being eroded from within. It was not like they were under assault from external forces. It was like, you know, like they posed this kind of dichotomy between Viktor Orban on one side, the nativist kind of dialogue, discourse that he had set up in Hungary, and the other kind of more cosmopolitan vision of, you know, say Emmanuel Macron, let's say. But, you know, we should qualify that because even Macron uses that nativist vision quite frequently for political advantage, right?
Yes,
so,
yes. Okay, Shubham.
if it's a 5-year-long or a 10-year-long process of decline and disintegration of the international order,
yes, we
obviously
see that
there is no mechanism for enforcing whatever we conceive as international.
Exactly. International law is not ideal. International order has problems. They have been and there will be. But the point of having international law is exactly to reduce what is happening in Russia, Ukraine. Again and again and again, there will be violations of international law, but without the law, there will be a jungle where the might will be right always and the big will kill the weak quickly. So even if not, again, let's take the criminal law, domestic law. Why don't we dismiss it every time a murderer kills a victim? Not way. We need the criminal law exactly as to prevent the next murder. We need to put the aggressor into the prison exactly to prevent. It might not always happen. It may happen in 70 or 80% of the time. But without that law, international or domestic, murderers, aggressors will do everything they want to do. Again, the international system is not ideal, but this is what we have. This is what states agree, and this is what we need to do and be solidarist with the victim, as in this case, to help Ukraine as much as possible to survive and not to let another great power in the future to use our weakness today as to do the same as Russia did to Ukraine. Clear at that. I agree. I can be also very critical and basically disappointed with the way international law doesn't always work, but the 70–80% of the time it works. Thank you. Julian.
Yes, thank you very much. If you don't mind, I would like to ask a little question to the panel concerning double standards. I would be very curious to know the position of our colleagues about the Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean, because in accordance with NATO official doctrine, it is perfectly normal to display heavy weapons to Ukraine, to display soldiers maybe, or maybe someday nuclear weapons to Ukraine, because Ukraine is a sovereign country, even if Ukraine is located in the Russian neighborhood. But in the Pacific Ocean, it is not normal, it is not acceptable for NATO that Solomon Islands sign a military pact with China. Although the Solomon border, Solomon Island is located more than 3,000 kilometers from Australia and even more from the United States. So I would be curious to know your opinion about this double standard. Why what is working in Ukraine is not working for the Solomon Island?
Anybody from the panel? Because we need to move to a third panel. I see that.
Yeah, I would very quickly say that first of all, in the South China Sea and also in the Pacific, the behavior that China has exhibited towards freedom of navigation, etc., etc., and also the kind of interference that Russia is helping inside the Solomon Islands and also other states on the African continent who have allied themselves with them, makes that qualitatively a very different situation than in Ukraine, where no NATO troops are there. There was no threat there, right? And this even goes for the Baltic states, right? I think the real history here is that if the situation was like Russia portrayed it with regard to the Baltics and Poland, NATO would have been able to say to Russia, if you attack Ukraine, we are going to come. But because the eastern flank of NATO was so unprotected, right? If you look in December, the contingent of, or even 1 year ago, the contingent of NATO soldiers in Lithuania was 3,000. With this, you basically you don't do anything. It's negligible in terms of military strength. So that is, in my opinion, the qualitative difference, right? That the Solomon Islands, as well as what China does in the South China Sea, has obviously an impact on many nations around the earth who have, included, for example, freedom of navigation into their national security strategies. And on the other hand, there's no indication whatsoever that a democratic Ukraine, democratic Baltic states would hurt any kind of interest of the Russian Federation.
But do you really think that Ukraine is a democracy? Ukraine,
of course it is. Ukraine is a very, very big democracy, Julian. It has problems, it had corruptions in the past, but compare Russia with Ukraine. Ukraine is a democracy. It is the Ukrainian people who removed the right-wing parties from the parliament in the last elections. When people say about some small parties in Ukraine being pro-Nazi, the Ukrainian people denazify Ukraine in the last elections, putting those parties out of the parliament. So don't believe the Russian fantasies that Ukraine is some sort of pro-Nazi regime. Absolutely not. Ukraine changed 6 times the president since Putin is in power. And Putin doesn't understand why one Ukrainian president give power to another Ukrainian president, why he didn't keep it for himself and grab the power and the money and everything else. Ukraine is a very pro-European in its history. Ukraine never have been any autocratic. If we go back to the 17th and 18th century, Ukraine is very much Central European, like Poland, like French. I think you can compare Poland, French, and Ukrainian in the same way. It's a very pro-European, very democratic people. Thank you. Let's move to the next panel.
All right, thank you very much, Veselin. So we are in the Geopolitics panel, and I think I will refrain myself from giving an opening observation and instead allow the speakers to express themselves, and perhaps I'll just summarize what we have said so far. So right now on the panel, we have Professor Dennis Layton, we have Professor Sukumar, Professor Ganesh, I believe he's here also, and finally my colleague from JSA, Professor Tatiana. So I just would like to humbly request everyone to limit your response perhaps to 5 minutes so that we have time for questions and for conclusion. So Professor Dennis, over to you.
Yes, thank you. When I agreed to participate in this panel, I wouldn't say I agreed reluctantly. I was happy to do it, but I had trouble exactly seeing how I was going to fit in, and I'm not even particularly comfortable with this category of geopolitics. But you'll forgive me if this seems too much like a kind of excursion or journey into, European antiquarianism, but it is what it is. Interestingly enough, I'm perhaps taking off or using as a starting point rather off the cuff comment made by the moderator of the last panel about Ukraine being like France or Poland. Well, yes and no, certainly not very much like France in any way, but Poland, I think a lot can be understood about the current Russia-Ukraine relationship by understanding things about Poland and also about outmoded, long defunct polities such as the Habsburg Empire. And although I'm a historian of Europe, I'm not a historian of Eastern Europe or even necessarily of Central Europe, Middle Europa, but in part because of my own ancestry as well as my travels and so on, I feel strongly about things in that part of the world, what I call Middle Europa, including what's now Ukraine, or Western Ukraine at least, and what was once called Galician or Galicia. And just to give you a preview so you don't get lost in the details, and I'm going to drastically shorten what I intended to say anyway, but just so you don't get lost in the details, one of my main takeaways is that a lot about the current relationship between Ukraine and Russia, as well as between Ukraine and other parts of Europe, of course, goes directly back to structures and patterns that were put in place over several hundreds of years, particularly in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, period when what was quaintly called Galicia and Lodomeria was put under Habsburg rule in the last third of the 18th century, and was then more or less partitioned between Russian, Prussian, and Austrian empires. And before that, nearly 4 centuries, or certainly 3 centuries of Polonization, which is to say cultural and political and economic dominance of the Poles, or at least Polish grandees in Ruthenia or Galicia. I'm talking about from the late 14th century all the way up to the mid 18th century. And even to me at least as a historian, fairly recent history of the 20th century is intimately bound with the fate of Poland, and particularly the so-called Second Polish Republic, which was established at the end of the First World War, and was an attempt of the Poles to reassert their freedom in their national independence, win it back from the Austrians, the Germans, and the Russian Empire. But again, the takeaway here is that Austrians, quote unquote, as well as Russians and Poles before 1939, and Russians especially during the Second World War and afterwards, have opportunely, one might even say opportunistically, fostered Ukrainian or Ruthenian nationalism in their struggles against each other. That's no secret. It's not an original claim on my part by any means. Everyone knows that the Austrians during the so-called liberal period of the late Habsburg dynasty from the 1860s onwards, and the policy of what was called Ausgleich, where there was a kind of limited policy of what we might today call multiculturalism, devolving more power and authority to local ethnic groups, including the Ruthenians. In some ways, from the perspective of the late 20th and early 20th century, the Habsburgs end up being the good guys in a way, ironically. But that said, certainly Austrians, Russians, and Poles before the Second World War, and the Russians, of course, a couple of decades before that, and particularly during and after the Second World War, have opportunely fostered Ruthenian or Ukrainian nationalism in their struggles against each other, so that Ukrainian nationalists have always had a variety of allies to choose from over several hundred of years, and those included the Poles and the Russians at various points, and also the Habsburg Empire. And in my kind of random, not exactly random, but focused reading on this topic, I was reading something about a particular town that's always mentioned in the news these days, although I'm sure many of you had never heard of it before, the Ukrainian city of Lviv, or what the Poles call Lvov and the Austrians call Lemberg, a place where I think my maternal grandmother's uncle was stationed as a bureaucrat before as an Austrian before the First World War. Anyway, there are a lot of studies of Central European cultural politics in the 19th and 20th century, which depict Lviv, which even in today's media is presented as being some kind of, I don't know, refuge or almost as a utopia. Forget the occasional Russian missiles which land on it. At least as of today, it's relatively unscathed and so on. And of course, that's the point from which many Ukrainian refugees have gone into Poland and Slovakia and other places. But let's not forget that there have been many decades of very tense relations between Ukrainians and Poles as well. And their relations were as unhappy, one might say, as the current relations between Ukrainians and Russians are. So if we talk about going back to this this fact, which is also mentioned, or rather this point, which is disputed by international lawyers, and of course by Russian leaders about whether Ukraine has any independent claim to existence at all, well, it depends. And certainly the fact that from the Russian perspective, as well as from the Ukrainian perspective, whether one looks at the late Tsarist period, the Soviet period, or the post-Soviet period, the center of Russian history is a place called Kievan Rus, okay, which is claimed by both Russians and Ukrainians as being them. Okay, and in spite of a lot of jostling for control of Central Europe over many centuries, which included not only the Russians and the Austrians and Germans, but even at some point the Hungarians and even the Ottoman Empire, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, there's no doubt that Russian and Ukrainian histories have been, very uniquely conjoined for a very long time. So that, I may be perhaps overdoing this thing about Polonization and anti-Polish feeling, but after all, going back to the claim about Ukraine's independence, one of the first states, of Ukraine with the word Ukraine in it in modern times, after all, is the West Ukrainian People's Republic, established right at the end of the First World War in November of 1918, okay, which represents a kind of culmination of Ukrainian or Ruthenian cultural as well as political struggles throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, and that West Ukrainian People's Republic was quashed by the Poles. Okay, so it was upon that there was a struggle for 2 years between Poles and Ukrainians for control of Lemberg, Lviv, Lvov, as well as Eastern Galicia. So I'm not saying anything new, of course, but while it's easy to look at the kind of put focus on the Russia-Ukrainian relationship as being the problematic one, I think it'll be interesting, whatever happens to Ukraine in the next year or couple of years, to see what the emerging relationship between Ukraine and other parts of Central Europe, particularly Poland, are. Poland, of course, has apparently quite evidently, quite generously absorbed the largest number of Ukrainian displaced people and refugees. And everyone, at least according to the international media, no one seems to be very unhappy about it. But of course, we'll see how things turn out in the next couple of years. I think, again, there are a couple of things I wanted to say about, kind of the balance of ethnicities and their struggles against each other, even in the past century or century and a half, and I will spare you that. But again, the point I made before, that this very multi-sided struggle involving, a polity which no longer exists, the Habsburg Empire, but as well as Russia, as well as Poland, has been central to the Ukrainian experience for a long time, and particularly for the past century and a half. said nothing about the Jews, but of course the position of Jews in Ukraine has been a very ambiguous one, and I think a lot of Ukrainians and Ukrainian sympathizers are kind of patting themselves on the back due to the fact that Ukraine's current leader is Jewish, and certainly seems to be progress and something to celebrate. But of course, the relationship between Ukrainians and Jews in places like Lviv and elsewhere has been far from happy over a long period of time. Actually, I will just finish up here by saying that I find myself quite convinced or quite persuaded by historians like Christoph Mick and Gabor Lagzi in recent years, who have paid a lot of attention to the cultural politics of Galicia and particularly Western Ukraine, not only over the past century, but even in the past 2 or 3 decades. And although I've not been to Lviv, I'd like to see it sometime, hope I can. It's interesting how if one even looks at attempts of Ukrainians to kind of reclaim Lviv as a place, which again is not obvious because there were many Ukrainian intellectuals in the late 19th century who said, this place is not as important to us. I mean, only 20% of the population in Lviv in about 1900 consists of Ukrainians. There are more Germans there than Ukrainians, and there are Poles and Jews and so on. So a lot of kind of formation of historical consciousness, I think, among Ukrainians is actually a fairly recent development, because we all actually have very short memories and aren't always aware of what happened even last year, much less what happened 30 or 40 years ago at the time of our parents or whatever. But I'm persuaded by people like Christoph Mick and Gabor Lagzi and others who talk about kind of look at the attempts at cultural restoration of Western Ukraine in particular, and the attempts to kind of reassert or kind of re-anchor Ukrainian national identity according to kind of 3 poles. One is a national idea of Ukraine, which is as difficult or as easy to sustain as any other national idea, including India's. There are lots of things both for and against it, and one can, strategically choose your examples and so on. But certainly one force has been a particular national idea which developed really in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and also a very tense political process that is happening, I think, in Ukraine even now, and it was certainly happening in the first 2 decades of this century, about a kind of
Professor Dennis, I apologize. Could you wrap up in 1 minute?
Certainly. A selective appropriation of a partly alien past, which includes a substantial Jewish element, and again, as I kept saying, a Polish element, something that Ukrainians have been very selective about, as we all are in establishing our historical identities. And the third element here, I think, is and I guess this is my one original point, if I have one here, a kind of Mitteleuropa or Central European orientation. I think this, we tend to reify this East-West polarity. I've been hearing a lot about Western Enlightenment and Western values and rule of law and so on, as if that's all Western, and it's definitely not Eastern. We need to remember that there are all kinds of intellectuals among all of these groups, ethnic and religious groups I've mentioned, who tried out different ideas about Galicia and Ruthenia and so on as being neither East nor West. We had German intellectuals in the late 19th century referring to Ukraine or Ruthenia as halb Asien, half Asia. The Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich during the Napoleonic Wars said, the East begins on the road from Vienna to Budapest. That's where Asia begins. Okay, so there's been a lot of kind of searching among different ethnicities in the region about whether we are East or West or something else. And I think there's sort of some space to kind of reimagine kind of Mitteleuropa or Middle Europe identity that's neither East nor West. Whether that's going to be somehow the political magic bullet and solve the problem, I wouldn't claim that at all. But I would say that my Ukrainian colleague is not here, but I think this this claim about a Western identity has really not come to the fore until the past 20 years. I don't think, I mean, I grew up among a lot of expatriate Ukrainians in Chicago, and it's not something that a lot of Ukrainians talked about until I think about 20 or 25 years ago. So reifying this Western Eastern thing is not really going to help us understand either the cultural politics or I think even the more grittier political equation between Russia and Ukraine at the present moment. So I'll stop now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Dennis. By the way, judging by what you have said, I believe you ended in the right panel because you mentioned the key words: imperialism, colonialism, and nationalism. So these are actually, you know, alternative explanations to more geopolitical NATO enlargement thing. So definitely you hit a nail there. Let's move to Professor Sukumar. Professor, would you like to add something onto your points about EHCAR or nativism?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we'll pick up the narrative from there.
And
yeah,
please I would like to kindly ask you to be very brief.
Yeah, of course, I'll have to be by compulsion. I have a class at 6 o'clock. So, you know, let me just take off from this point that was made by speakers in the first panel, that the economic impact of sanctions so far seem not very obvious. Whether it's going to have an impact in the months ahead, of course, one cannot say at this time. Economies are very unpredictable now, despite whatever the economists say. Most of their forecasts invariably end up being completely askew, right? I mean, that's the reality of today's global economy. So, so there could be a catastrophic meltdown of the Russian economy in the months ahead. We can't say very much on that. But looking at the current evidence, I think The Economist, magazine, The Economist, diagnosis of the issue is that Russia is by and large an autarkic economy. It's highly self-contained. They don't have very deep linkages with the rest of the world. And like Professor Vinit said, the Russian capital market is very, very kind of loosely integrated with the global market. And it's a very small one because capital market is determined by what happens in Wall Street and the City of London. I mean, the global fortunes of capital flows are determined by what happens in Wall Street and the City of London. So in terms of the economic impact, as of now, there's not very much happening. What could happen in future months? Of course, a significant decision by European Union just a few days back that they will cut oil imports from Russia to zero. There's some dissent within, and some of the smaller economies are being given longer transition periods. And let's just look at the transition periods that they're talking about. One is end of 2023, the other is end of 2024. So by then, the war most likely will be over, or it would have settled into some kind of a long drawn-out war of attrition, kind of low-level insurgency, probably in the occupied regions of Donbass, and maybe right up to Odessa, because I kind of suspect that Putin's target is Odessa, and after that, he's going to probably declare a ceasefire. The naval strategist would probably have something to say on that. So, so if that is that's how things are going to work out, and the dependence, the flow of hard currency into Russian treasury is not going to dramatically reduce, then obviously we're not looking at any compelling reasons why the Russians should call off their offensive immediately. So, and of course, we should also recognize, taking the longer view, that this is not any development from yesterday. The energy interdependence between Europe and Russia is not an event that happened yesterday. It's been going on from the 1970s. I think the first pipelines were put down in the 1970s. In the 1980s, there was a big phase of expansion, and then again in the early years of this century. And of course, there's never been a US president since Ronald Reagan who has not taken serious exception to this, who's not tried to stop that developing interdependence. Reagan went so far as to impose sanctions on all kinds of oil pipeline suppliers, but didn't get very far. They did manage to build that pipeline, and that relationship continues to flourish. Now, how do you adapt to a situation of strategic rivalry and economic interdependence? I think one or the other has to give. And here, I think the West made certain decisions to arrive at a kind of rapprochement with what was the Soviet Union, and later late years, Russia is the recognized successor state. And these were, of course, these were efforts to bring down the temperature of the confrontation. And three crucial landmarks there are, of course, one was, of course, before, it was from 1972, the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, which committed both sides to not deploying missile defenses, which means they're both equally vulnerable to nuclear attack, and they hence have an incentive to not launch those first strikes, right? So curious logic, nuclear warfare engenders in people. Defense becomes immoral, and defense becomes a means of deterring offense. Second one was the Conventional Nuclear Forces in Europe Treaty, which seriously reduces the strategic advantage the Soviet Union had on the landmass of Europe, because that was regarded as a potential trigger for nuclear war, because the Soviets exercised their massive strategic advantage on the European theater. There was a possibility that the retaliation would take a nuclear dimension, and that would set off, of course, uncontrollable events. So the Soviet Union kind of made that sacrifice of writing off a significant part of its strategic superiority in the European continent. And of course, soon afterwards, the Soviet Union disintegrated, and whatever numbers were agreed in terms of land-based warfare equipment was shared out between Russia and 8 successor states, right? So, and the third one, of course, was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces and Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, if you look at the history of these efforts at strategic rapprochement, they've all kind of fallen by the wayside. And most recently, of course, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was abrogated by the United States. In 2002, they walked out of the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, and the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty never got very far, because what happened is that the agreed limits on both sides got completely thrown out of gear by the strategic readjustments, because what was in the Warsaw Pact column got transferred into the NATO column. So essentially it led to a massive strategic imbalance between Russia and the rest of Europe. So when there was talk of a new security architecture for Europe to follow the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, I don't believe that the building blocks were lacking. Building blocks were there. The only thing was that they had to be taken up and rebuilt in good faith by both sides. Now, was good faith lacking on both sides, or was lacking on one side? Frankly, I don't think that we can arrive at a very kind of categorical judgment there. And, you know, if you see the kind of overall global mood, of course, in the last session, we had significant kind of worries and anxieties expressed over India's position in this matter. But frankly, I don't think that it is that incomprehensible. If you look at the history of the strategic rivalry on the European continent, and also you look at the history of India's own partnership with the Soviet Union, subsequently with Russia, there's nothing surprising there at all. I mean, it's exactly how you would expect things to work out, to kind of, you know, to turn out. So, yeah, I will end there. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I'm being called to account by the moderator. So I'll end there. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, especially for highlighting the geostrategic and security dimensions of the conflict, which is definitely an important part of the picture. Let's move on. Professor Ganesh, your turn.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just, first of all, at the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing such an important conference and giving me an opportunity to speak here today. I'm an ex-naval officer, and I have served most of my sea time in the Russian ships, missile ships, landing crafts, submarines, Foxtrot class, Kilo class. I was also a chief instructor in navigation, where I basically taught Russian submarine tactics. And my colleagues are very senior military officers now, the vice chief of Army, Navy, Air Force, the Northern Commander, the Strategic Forces Commander. So I generally have a more than a passing sort of familiarity with Russian military doctrine. I teach in the business school. I've not been involved in this particular field for some time, but I'll still talk about it. Okay, so first thing I want to say, okay, and we are also very happy that today this discussion is happening on 9th of May, which is the Victory Day being celebrated today in Russia to commemorate Russian victory or the Soviet victory over Germany. And the Operation Barbarossa, which was it was the biggest invasionary force ever assembled in human history. Okay. Almost about 3 million people and 150 divisions. Hitler used it to attack what you call Moscow. Basically, it was to take over Moscow. And the Germans made a mistake then. Basically, they underestimated the capacity, ability of Germans, of the Russians to prosecute, the ability, the persistence and the obduracy of the Russians. And the Russians lost almost about, the Soviet basically lost about almost 28 million people in defending just in Operation Barbarossa. The Germans, who were the aggressors, they lost about 7 million for the whole of the World War II. So unless we are all rank hypocrites, we should all agree that the World War II was basically won by the Russians. And for all the other people, UK, US and all that, they lost only about 1 to 1.2 million people. That is not even about 5%, maybe about 3.5% of what the Russians lost just in one operation. Okay, so having said that, I want to say another point that about the war in Ukraine. This war is not about Ukraine, not anymore. This is a proxy war Russia is having with the United States. I'm not going to say NATO because NATO basically is a sideshow of the United States. Okay, I mean, NATO's US is the gang leader. It had 14 people. Now it has got about 30 people. And all these 30 people are ganging up against one country. Okay, so that is the thing. There are 3 certainties in this war. Okay, that Ukraine will never win this war. Russia will never lose this war. And Ukraine is going to get massacred. It is going to get wrecked. And the longer you delay it, that much more Ukraine is going to get wrecked. Okay, and the United States is following a textbook policy. This is what it does. It basically, makes the locals fight their war. Okay, that this has happened in the Bay of Pigs, and it has happened all over the place. And this again, which is being replicated in the Ukraine. Okay, so what they do is first they delegitimize the government, then they create some disaccord within the, within the country. Then they find some, puppet person or some joker, and they install him as a puppet regime. Then they use him to gain international support that, the other country is invading. This is a classic textbook ploy, which is again being played out in Ukraine. Okay. And we must all agree, I think we can all agree that the war did not start on 24th of February. It basically started at least in 2014 when the elected government was, removed in the Maidan coup. Okay. And subsequently, for the last 8 years, the Ukrainian Nazi forces, particularly the Nazi battalion, they have been massacring almost 14,000 of the Russian-speaking minority people. So there was serious provocation for Russia. Okay. So then I think one of the topics they had said was, what is the role of NATO? We can't talk of role of NATO unless we talk about the role of the United States and the role of the US, United Nations and the role of the US. Let's talk about the role of United States. Okay. So, first of all, let's remove this hoax that NATO is a defensive organization. NATO is an offensive organization. There should not be any doubt. You just need to look at the history of wars it has participated. And we are not even, the last war was the imaginary WMDs in Iraq. And, so we'll come back to that a little later. So, okay. And second thing is, I would suggest that many of you read a book by, Christopher Kelly or, that Lowlock, where they document US invasions across the world. There have been 84 invasions by the United States out of 194 countries. There have been 191 military occupations or military involvement by the United States out of 194 countries. So it is almost, they are a little short of 100%. So US has basically invaded in every country, every part of the world. Okay. Okay, so next we need to talk about is, and of course I need to mention a caveat which I wrote in the email also. United States does not, do war crimes. They only export democracy. It's for good of world order and those kind of things. Okay, so and they have already stated that in so many terms. Actually, the US attorney actually said the same sort of something similar in the United Nations. Okay, then let's talk about the role of the United Nations. The United Nations does not reflect the current realities at all. India is probably the world's largest populated country now. It is definitely the 3rd largest economy PPP wise. It has got the 2nd largest military, and the United States does not, and India does not have a seat in the Security Council. So everybody, when we keep talking about, we should talk about world order and all that. What world order? Whose rules? Why should we follow those rules when we are not being represented? Okay, so these are, another thing we have looked at is, and we have small countries like the United Kingdom and all, they have a seat in the Security Council. And we all know about United Kingdom. They stole about $71 trillion from between the imperial time. We bankrolled their, what you call war on the Second World War, and those kind of things of it. The more other important thing is the way United States has been weaponizing the global public goods. Okay, that is the United Nations, IMF, now about the shift system. We need to be very careful. We both get into a fight. We don't want a third person taking away our money and running away. This is absolutely amazing. The kind of, the way US is weaponizing everything which is possible. Next, probably they will capture Russians in other part of the country and hold them hostage negotiation or something. It's very much possible. Yeah. So I think another topic they were talking about is about nationalism, imperialism, identity. So let's get to Russia is definitely.
Would you wrap up in 1 minute, please, Professor Ganesh? We're running out of time.
Okay, so Russia is definitely not an imperialistic power. Basically, some of the speaker has said that basically they sell raw materials. And Russia has got a population of 1/10 of India. Russia GDP is in half of India. And we need to go back to the United States, which is actually 16 times Russia GDP. Its defense budget is 16 times Russia GDP. In fact, the United spends more on nuclear weapons than the Russia's whole of military. Okay? And Russia does not export capital. Capital by nature is predatory. So that is the reason Russia is definitely not an imperial power. Okay, we come down to the last one about the implications for international security. So let's get one thing clear. This is Biden's war, not Putin's war. Okay, so weak president normally, they normally create war. I don't know how many of you have noticed. We have the Spider-Man, Batman, all of them are from America. The American president's actual alter ego is the United States military. Okay, and the weak president normally gravitate more to that. The war is the bonanza for the United States military. They are making money. I think latest one is the $33 million they're sending to Ukraine. And of course, not giving it to Ukraine. There's going to be lend, lease, and debt trap. It's basically a debt trap to trap Ukraine for the foreseeable perpetuity. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So obviously, you find that Biden is at record. He wants a regime change. Then there is the defense secretary. He just signed off as the board member in Raytheon, and he comes running and takes oath as the defense secretary. I mean, what could be something more bizarre than that? And I think many speakers have already spoken about the various, provocations with respect to 2002, 2008. 2014 was the Maidan Revolution, 2018, and 2020 was the open skies policies. America has been gradually walking away. Today, the situation is that a Pershing missile can attack Moscow within a span of 5 minutes. And so Russia has been seriously threatened. And in such a situation, the Professor Sukumar said, the existing architecture is clearly a very threatening situation and Russia to act. There's no point having an army if you don't use it. There's no point getting Russia and say, we should not have the army or something like that. Okay, so and the NATO has already proved itself to be completely unreliable. I think somebody said, James Baker said one thing, even way back, when the Americans bombarded Nagasaki and Hiroshima, within 1 month they made a plan to actually attack Soviet Union to remove it. Way back in 1977, I think Brzezinski or something, National Security Advisor, he made a plan that we must go eastwards. We must sort of integrate Ukraine into NATO. This is 1977. And subsequently, we have seen after 1990, 14 times the Russians, the Americans have lied, and 14 times they have gone into what is known as, basically, who are all these Baltic states? They are like ex-wives and girlfriends. So the passion and the volatility is very, very high. That's why the visceral hate is being explained as to, why people can hate Russia. I don't understand how people can hate Russia so much. In spite of them, they are the ones who actually allowed them to go. Okay, so
Professor Ganesh, would you mind wrapping up? We need to move on.
Okay, fine. So I just finished off. Basically, what we need, finally, I just conclude. We don't understand what is this, what is the urgency? What is the kind of lightning speed which you should get in sanction? What is the lightning speed where you have to sanction, create war crime files against Putin? What is the lightning? There are so many things happening lightning speed. We did not see this kind of things is happening when, even the last thing when, United It is only going to who's good.
Alexander.
Sorry, I just lost connection. Yes, can we please move to Tatiana, please? Tatiana has been waiting for too long. Tanya, your turn.
Better to stay
diversifying. And that is going to set off another chain of events. So disruption of the global economy is very much. So yeah. So and also on the same day that the war in Ukraine started, the US Congress delegation was in Taiwan, right? And they were trying to solidify that flank of their informal partner. And the intention of it is very clear. Till Biden came, China was the big bad guy in the Western perception, right? Biden kind of changed the equation. The US is also fighting a war within between the isolationist approach of the Republican Party and the internationalists. Well, like Biden and so on, Hillary Clinton and so on, the internationalists. And that's the other fringe, the Republican right wing, you could call them, which believes that we should just mind our own business. And, so there are lots of these complex changes which have been triggered by this, and I can't make any prediction. It's just saying that the troubles are going to be with us for a long time.
So, in the historical perspective of Ukraine, and it seems from this, Ukraine never had a long period of nation-state position. It always had a fluid status, different big powers around it. So when we put Ukraine in that perspective, can this action over Ukraine be justified from a long-term perspective, given that Ukraine never really had a nation-state position?
First of all, to say that, yeah, I mean, of course, that's a big question. In saying that Ukrainian national identity has been fluid, it has always been manipulated by other powers. I'm not suggesting that that should continue. And I'm not even, I hope I didn't inject a note of cynicism. That's not what I intended at all. I think the Ukrainians see themselves as a separate nation and enter into various agreements or whatever, or should be allowed to enter into various agreements. That's certainly their right. Otherwise, what is international law about? No, I would not say that just because Galician has been handed among 6 or 7 different European and Asian states for the past 800 years is not an argument for saying, well, it's going to end up being in someone's orbit or not. My point actually about Central Europe was not even necessarily anti-NATO. It was neither pro-NATO nor anti-NATO, and it certainly wasn't pro-US. I'm just suggesting that Ukrainians, my sense, have had to manage with this ambiguity and this fluidity for a long time. And I'm also not going to make any predictions about what is going to happen in the next couple of years. My point was simply to point out that my point was simply that the kind of national feeling of Ukrainians is again just as malleable as that of any other so-called nation, and it will probably continue to change. The last point I was trying to make, and maybe that wasn't clear, is that we tend to reify this West-East thing, West, I mean, our friend here could say that, oh, the US has violated international law more than anyone else. I wouldn't even disagree. I agree, it has. But again, that's not really an argument for allowing this particular act of aggression to go unanswered. I disagree that somehow the main beneficiaries of this will be the US, or that US weapons industry. I mean, if anyone, it's the British and the Germans and even the Swedes who are making a lot of money. A lot of this weaponry, these anti-tank missiles and so on from Sweden. But again, look, the fact that, look, who could have imagined even a year ago that there was even a ghost of a chance of Sweden or Finland joining NATO, or even wanting to join NATO? Okay. This is serious business, right? Never have the Swedes or the Finns been, even in, Finland's also for some short period of time. But I mean, even the Finns in the 1940 winter war with Russia actually made considerable concessions to Russia, giving up a lot of Karelia, not because they really weren't expecting any aid from anyone else, but because they thought, actually, we do need to live with the Russians. The Russians will be there. We were once part of the Swedish Empire for hundreds of years. We were part of the Russian Empire for 100 years or more. Russia will continue to be our neighbors. The fact that Finland is now in a position where it's going to seriously consider joining NATO, I think says volumes about Russian missteps in this case. So I would agree with my colleague that no one can win from this war. It's even possible for both countries to lose in this war. It's probably best that I stop now. I don't have going back to Anirudh's question, no, I don't think the history of Central Europe or Eastern Europe provides some kind of argument for seeing Ukraine as this kind of floating signifier or place with no natural place or stable position in Europe. I think Ukrainians want to have a stable position in Europe. I would again emphasize what Professor Popovsky says. If there are fascists in Ukraine, they're a lot weaker than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. In other words, the fascist, so-called fascist elements, and I think there were some, were actually in a much weaker position as a result of political, dialogue and adjustments within Ukraine in 2018, 2019 than they were 3 or 4 years before. And I don't think that's a result of American intervention or Ukrainians being brainwashed or the West or NATO winning the information war. It's too early to, like any other aspect of the war. It's too early to proclaim winners in the information war, certainly. But I don't think that the changes that Ukrainians themselves agreed to, particularly over the past 6 or 7 years, are simply the result of brainwashing. I just don't see it.
If we don't believe that there is a sort of anti-Russian movement in Ukraine, because I have so many friends go to Ukraine, and it's impossible to imagine any anti-Russian. I know that Russian state always stands with their own. If it were to be happening, does it justify?
Sorry, what were to be happening?
State activities against the Russian citizens in Ukraine, yes, has been said by the Russian government.
Again, the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians, particularly in the East, is a very complicated one. And I don't know what to say. Again, it sounds corny to talk about family history. I mean, my stepfather was born in Ukraine in 1932 during the Holodomor, the so-called forced famine imposed by the Soviets. Her mother was Ukrainian, her father was Russian. Her father was a agronomist, taught at the agricultural University of Kharkov. I know Ukrainians, Russians who are just totally torn up by this. I don't know any Ukrainian or any Russian of my acquaintance who says, "Oh, go Ukraine or go Russia." Everyone's torn up. So the idea that somehow are there state actors in Ukraine which are anti-Russian? Certainly, but again, I think I would agree with what Professor Popovsky is saying, is that whatever imperfect democracy exists in Ukraine at this point, those forces have been weakened over the past 5 or 6 years. They might, even if this hadn't emerged, they might again have their moment, have a resurgence in some way. I think it's significant that they were weaker in 2019 than they were in 2014. That is the decidedly anti-Russian element.
Alexander, do you have last words? Alexander, you there? Alexander, you there? Alexander,
would you sleep or still there?
My apologies to the moderator. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So thanks a lot, man. Thanks a lot. Great, sir. I added you on LinkedIn. We haven't met. I would love to talk to you. Yeah.
Business school people we meet like this. Yeah, of course. I can talk now.
Yeah. But after your naval service,
hello, my son was here.
ठीक है तब तो
That was 20 years ago. I was in CWC.